Just before 8:00 the evening on the 3rd of September, 1981, a 31-year-old woman named Linda Slayton stood in her small kitchen in Lakeland, Florida. She was staring into her cupboard, and what she saw was not encouraging. The shelves were nearly bare. There were a couple of cans of beans, a bag of flour, and not much else. And seeing this sight, this emptiness, it gave Linda a familiar pit in her stomach. It was the feeling of knowing she had to somehow stretch these very few ingredients into a real, filling meal for her two growing boys. Linda was a single mother. She had two sons, Jeff, who was 15, and Tim, who was 12. And to say money was tight would be an understatement. Linda didn't have much at all. So, in order to make sure her kids were taken care of, she had to be incredibly resourceful. She had to be creative. This meant doing things like finding a way to make a real dinner out of just beans and flour. It also meant she would often make her kids, their clothes, herself, anything she could do to save a few dollars here and there. It was a constant struggle, but she did it for them. Up until just a few weeks ago, the family had been living in Alabama. But Linda had made the big decision to move them all to Lakeland, Florida. And she did this for a very specific reason. She had a lot of family and a strong support system there. Her sister lived there, her parents were nearby. And so Linda had really been hoping that with all that support, things would finally start to look up for her and her sons. She hoped their lives would improve, that it wouldn't feel like such a constant, grinding struggle all the time anymore. But so far, the big move to Lakeland had just felt like more of the same. The fresh start hadn't quite materialized yet. Linda was having a hard time finding a steady job, which was the cornerstone of her plan. So, in the meantime, she and the boys were getting by on government assistance and food stamps. But it never seemed to be enough. Especially not enough to keep two teenage boys, one of whom was an athlete, well-fed, and happy. And tonight was a perfect example of that pressure. Her youngest son, Tim, was due to be dropped off any minute. He had been at football practice, and Linda knew from experience that when he came home from practice, he was always starving. So she really, really wanted to have a hot dinner ready and waiting for him when he walked through the door. On top of that, there was another reason she wanted to get dinner done quickly. Linda was hopeful that if Tim and her other son Jeff ate fast enough, they would all have enough time to make it over to a neighbor's housewarming party later that evening. You see, all the neighbors in their new complex were basically as new as she was. The entire housing development had only been open for about 3 weeks. It was a big, sprawling development with around 81-story duplexes. Technically, it was government-subsidized housing, but it didn't really feel like it. It had more of a classic suburban feel. The units were arranged on quiet cul-de-sacs with neat little lawns where all the neighborhood kids would go outside and play together. It felt safe. It felt like a community. Linda's own sister, Judy, also lived in this same complex, which was a huge comfort. So Linda already knew at least one person very well. But for Linda, making friends of her own was also really important. She was an outgoing, friendly person by nature, and she was also newly single. She wanted to meet people and take her mind off her recent ex-boyfriend. Until just a little while ago, Linda had been dating a guy named Brendan Fowler. He had been really great at first. In fact, he was the one who had told her about this apartment complex in the first place. But over time, he'd started to get really controlling and possessive. It became suffocating. And just 2 days ago, Linda had finally gathered the strength to end things with him for good. And believe it or not, despite the empty cupboards and the job hunt, Linda was actually feeling sort of hopeful. She had believed that leaving Alabama and moving to Florida into this new complex, that this would be the big refresh that she and her kids so desperately needed. But now, she was starting to think that maybe the true reset, the real start, was the breakup with Brendan just a couple of days earlier. It was like all these big changes needed to happen together in order for their lives to really get on the right track. She felt like she was finally shedding all the old baggage. So, feeling a little bit optimistic, Linda looked back into the cupboard at her very limited ingredients. And suddenly, An idea sparked. She could actually make a quick bean casserole with just these few things. It wouldn't be fancy, but it would be hot and filling. So she reached in, grabbed the cans and the bag of flour, set them on the counter, and she got to work. About a half an hour later, the smell of baking filled the small duplex. Linda pulled a beautiful golden brown casserole out of the oven and set it on the counter to cool down. And that's when her older son, Jeff, wandered into the kitchen. He saw the casserole and immediately asked if dinner was ready. Linda told him it was, but she explained that they needed to wait for his brother Tim to get home from football practice first before they could all eat together. And when she said that, something in Jeff just snapped. He sort of blew up at her. He said he was really hungry right now, and he complained that there was basically no other food in the house, so he couldn't even grab a snack to tide himself over. He just kept saying, "Come on, let me eat now." Now, Jeff's reaction made Linda pretty mad. But at the same time, it didn't really surprise her. He was 15, and he had been talking back to her a lot lately. It seemed like the two of them were fighting all the time over small things. Linda knew, deep down, that he was sort of just being a typical teenager. And he was really hungry, she got that. He was testing her limits. But she was just getting so tired of the constant conflict. And so before she could even really think about what she was saying, she snapped right back at him. She said, "Well, if you don't like it here, you can leave." And at that, Jeff didn't hesitate. He literally stormed out of the house and slammed the front door shut behind him. The sound echoed through the quiet duplex. Linda went over to the front window and watched as her son grabbed his bike from the lawn and pedaled off angrily down the road, disappearing around the corner. After he was gone, Linda let out a long sigh. She walked over to her phone and she called her mom. She assumed, correctly, that Jeff would probably head straight to his grandparents' house since they lived nearby. And when Linda's mother picked up the phone, Linda warned her that Jeff might be showing up soon and that he would probably be hungry and looking to eat. Her mom said that was perfectly fine, not to worry, and that they would make sure he had dinner and then drop him back off at home afterwards. Then her mom's tone changed. She said she was actually glad that Linda had called because another letter had arrived in the mail for her. And as soon as Linda heard the word letter, she felt this cold wave of anxiety wash over her. She knew exactly what kind of letter her mother was talking about. Linda's ex-husband, the father of Tim and Jeff, was a man named Frank Slayton. He still lived back in Alabama. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic, and they had been divorced for 7 long years. But even after all that time, Frank had never stopped harassing Linda. He just wouldn't let go. And ever since Linda and the boys had moved to Lakeland, he had started mailing these threatening letters to Linda's parents' house. In them, he would ramble on about how Linda had ruined his life. And so now, Linda was standing there on the phone, thinking that no matter how many fresh starts she tried to create for her family, it seemed like Frank was always going to find a way to screw them up. He was a dark cloud that was never going to go away. And so, after taking a deep, calming breath, Linda told her mom on the phone to just rip the letter up. She didn't even want to see it. She didn't want to read the words. She just wanted it gone. Not long after she hung up the phone with her mother, her younger son Tim came in through the front door. He was all sweaty and covered in dirt from football practice, but he had a smile on his face. And right away, Linda asked him, "Hey, did you thank your coach for giving you a ride home?" And Tim nodded and said, "Yes, I did." You see, Linda didn't have a car. She couldn't afford one. So Tim's football coach always had to give him a ride home from practice. Linda always made sure Tim was polite about it. Tim assured her, "I thanked him, like always," and so Linda told him to hurry up and get his food because they had to go next door to the neighbor's party soon. Hours later, after 11 p.m. that evening, Linda and Tim were walking home from the party, making their way through the dark and quiet apartment complex. There had been about 7 other people at the party, and it had been a lot of fun. It was simple. Everybody just drank iced tea and played card games while they talked about the perks of living in this great new complex. They talked about the convenient business district right across the street and how responsive and helpful the maintenance team was. It was exactly the kind of friendly neighborhood feeling Linda had been hoping for. So she was glad they went. She was also completely exhausted. And she knew her sister always came over for coffee first thing in the morning, so she needed to get to bed now or she would never be able to wake up on time. However, when she and Tim got back to their unit and she opened the front door, Linda froze right there in the doorway. Because there was already somebody inside their home, for a split second her heart jumped, thinking it might be an intruder. But then her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she realized it was just her older son, Jeff. He had come back. He was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter. He had a sort of, "I'm sorry" expression on his face. He looked guilty. Tim, her younger son, saw the situation, understood what was happening, and immediately and quietly disappeared into the second bedroom to give his mother and his brother some space to talk. Linda walked into the kitchen to join Jeff. He didn't say anything at first. So, Linda decided to speak first. She gently reminded him that it was never a good idea to go to bed angry. However, Jeff still didn't say anything. He just looked down at the floor. And Linda knew from plenty of experience with her son that it was better not to force him to talk when he was like this. So she decided she would just give him a minute. She turned her back to him and began quietly washing the few dishes that were in the sink, giving him time to collect his thoughts. Finally, after a few moments of silence, Jeff mumbled that he loved his mom. And Linda smiled. She felt this huge sense of relief that they could just move on from their silly fight. She turned around and told him it was all good, and that she loved him too. Then they both said goodnight. Jeff went over to the cot in the living room where he slept. And Linda finished up in the kitchen, turned off all the lights, and headed into her own bedroom. She closed her door behind her, and she went to bed. The next morning at 8:30 a.m., Linda's sister, Judy Butler, walked up the path to Linda's duplex. They had a routine. They had coffee together every single morning since they had both moved to the neighborhood. So, Judy expected this morning to be like any other. She would knock on her sister's door, and Linda would open it, and she would go right in. But this time, after she knocked, nobody answered. There was just silence. So, Judy waited a moment, and then she knocked again, a little bit louder this time. And when there was still no response, Judy reached down and she tried the doorknob. But she found it was locked. This had never happened before. Linda always answered the door, or at least called out to say she was coming. But Judy wasn't really worried. Not yet. She just figured that Linda must have overslept or something. They had been at that party last night, after all. So Judy decided she would just go home for now and let her sister have a few more minutes of sleep. She figured eventually she would just call the house to check in on her and make sure she was okay. However, as she started to walk away from the home, she noticed something strange on the side of Linda's duplex. One of the back windows was missing its screen. The screen was just gone. And Judy knew that that particular window belonged to Linda's bedroom. And she was sure that it hadn't been like that yesterday. So, seeing it now, it made her feel a little bit uneasy. A small knot of concern started to form in her stomach. So, she walked off the path and over to the side of the house to get a closer look. She went right up to the window and peered inside. And when she looked in, she saw her sister. Linda was in her bed, and she looked like she was fast asleep. And for a second, Judy was just relieved. This confirmed her theory. Her sister had just overslept. That's all this was. But then, as she kept looking, Judy realized there was something off about the way Linda was lying there. The way she was positioned, it just seemed wrong. It was unnatural. And then, in a horrifying flash, everything clicked into place for her. Her brain finally processed what her eyes were seeing. And in that moment, she staggered backwards away from the window and began to scream. By 9 a.m., on the 4th of September 1981, a crowd of reporters and police officers had surrounded the duplex in the Lakeland, Florida housing complex where a woman had reported seeing a dead body. In the middle of all the chaotic activity, Sergeant Edgar Pickett of the Lakeland Police ducked under a line of yellow crime scene tape. He headed towards the home's front walkway with a heavy bag of equipment slung over his shoulder. Now, Pickett was a veteran officer. He was actually just 1 year away from retirement after 2 long decades as a detective. And for the last few years of his career, he'd been the head of Lakeland's crime scene unit. This meant he was the one who oversaw the collection and the documentation of all the evidence at major crime scenes. So, while he wasn't the lead investigator on this particular case, when it came to the meticulous work of forensic analysis and fingerprint collection, he was the best they had. He'd already been briefed on the situation on his way over. He knew that this was very likely a homicide. The victim had been identified as 1-year-old Linda Slayton. He knew that Linda had been found in her bedroom by her sister, who had then flagged down a nearby maintenance worker and asked him to call 911. Pickett also knew that when the first responding officers got inside the house, they found that Linda's 2 kids were still asleep in their beds. They appeared to have absolutely no idea that their mother was deceased just in the next room. And Pickett knew right away that this fact would give the investigators a rough timeline to start with. It meant Linda was clearly alive when her kids went to sleep, and she must have died sometime during the night while they were still sleeping. As Pickett walked up the walkway towards the front door, he passed by 2 teenage boys who were sitting in their pajamas on the grass just outside the tape. He assumed, correctly, that these must be the sons. One of them just sort of stared straight ahead, his face a blank mask, seemingly in complete shock. The other, younger one, was sobbing quietly into his brother's shoulder. Pickett wasn't sure if any of the other officers had spoken to them yet, but he knew that they would likely be really helpful in focusing his search for evidence. Since they lived in the house, they would know the habits and the patterns of everyone who lived there. They might be able to tell him if anything at all seemed out of place. So, Pickett made a mental note to make sure to check in with the investigators who were already inside about that. Then, he stopped at the front door, looked at the house, and took a deep breath. Pickett liked to get a sort of first impression of a crime scene before he did any actual evidence collection. It was his process. So before he would go inside, he would do a slow walk around the entire exterior of the house and sort of assess the building. He had been told that all the doors were locked when the first police officers got there. And from what he could see now, the bedroom window with the missing screen was the only visible sign of a potential break-in. So he took out his kit and he spent some time carefully dusting around that window area for prints. But he didn't find much there. And he also didn't see any noticeable shoe impressions in the soft dirt outside beneath the window. And then, when he finally headed inside, Pickett quickly moved past all the other officers and detectives that were already milling about in the living room and kitchen. He went straight to Linda's bedroom. And the very first thing he saw when he got inside was Linda's body on the bed. There was a thin metal coat hanger wrapped tightly around her throat. The bed sheets all around her were covered in blood. She was shirtless, and the bottom of her dress was pulled up around her waist. And when Pickett got a little closer, he could see where all the blood had come from. There were long, very deep scratches all over Linda's neck, which he guessed were from her own fingernails. It looked like she had desperately tried to pry the hanger away from her throat. He would have to wait for the official autopsy report, of course, but it was clear just from looking at her wounds that the hanger had been used to strangle her to death. And considering she was partially naked and the positioning of her clothes, he guessed she had also likely been sexually assaulted. Pickett took a step back and slowly looked around the rest of the room, trying to decide where he should even begin his work. He needed to find as much forensic evidence in this room as was humanly possible. So, the first thing he did was try to mentally reconstruct what might have happened. He tried to guess how the killer might have moved through and interacted with the crime scene. That way he could follow their sort of imagined path with more intention and focus. He figured the killer must have come in through that open window, since that was the only entrance into the house that was obviously tampered with. He noted that Linda's purse and her jewelry were still sitting untouched on the dresser. The drawers of the dresser were all closed, as opposed to being pulled open and rifled through. So, it didn't seem like the killer had touched any of that stuff, which also meant this was likely not a robbery that had gone wrong. In fact, it seemed like the first and only thing the killer had done after entering the room was attack Linda. Because aside from the bloody bed, Pickett didn't see any other signs of a struggle. There were no knocked-over lamps, no chairs out of place. It seemed to him that Linda was likely caught completely off guard by a very fast and sudden attack, and she was unable to really fight back quickly. Because if she had, the room would probably be a huge mess. But then, Pickett's eyes caught a glimpse of Linda's closet, and he noticed that the clothes inside were all hanging on thin metal hangers that looked absolutely identical to the one that was wrapped around Linda's neck. And that's when a new theory hit him. The killer must have, at some point, been inside that closet, hiding. He supposed it was possible the killer could have broken in first and then grabbed a hanger from the closet once the attack started. But that would have taken too much time. It would have been clumsy and noisy, and it also would have given Linda a chance to get off the bed, or fight back, or yell out, and maybe wake her sons up. It seemed much more likely, much more logical, that the killer had broken in earlier, before Linda even came home. He had hidden in the closet, and then he waited there in the dark until Linda was in her bed and asleep before he came out to attack. If Pickett was right about that, this murder became something very different. It was now a premeditated, thought-out murder, which meant the killer must have either known Linda personally or they had been watching her. They had been stalking her, because they would have had to have known her schedule, known when to sneak into the room and not be detected. At this point, Pickett took out his gear again and began thinking about how he was going to approach the evidence collection. He figured he would start at the window, since that was the point of entry. He would spend a lot of time there. And then he would move to the closet. Those would be his two primary areas of focus. And so, once he had that plan in his mind, he went back over to the window and he began meticulously looking for any trace evidence. And sure enough, after only a few minutes of carefully dusting the frame and the ledge, he smiled to himself. Because there, on the ledge, clear as day, was a very well-defined handprint. The following afternoon, over 24 hours after Linda's body had been found, Pickett sat in the precinct's fingerprint lab. He was hunched over a table, comparing two sets of prints with a large magnifying glass. He had been at it for hours already, and his head was pounding. After processing the crime scene the day before, Pickett had gone back to the station to review all the evidence he'd collected. And while he was there, he decided he would go check in with the lead detectives to get a full update on the case. And what they would tell him is that they had spoken to all of the neighbors, as well as Linda's family members, and they did have a few solid leads and a pretty clear timeline. According to Linda's kids, the older son Jeff had been dropped off at home at about 9:30 p.m. after being with his grandparents. Then Tim, the younger son, and Linda herself had gotten back from the neighbor's housewarming party just after 11 p.m. They had all gone to bed around midnight, and neither of the brothers had heard a single thing until the police woke them up the next morning. And all of this information had led the investigators to agree with Pickett's initial interpretation of the scene. Linda's attack had to have been very, very fast. It seemed like she had not been able to even scream, or else it almost certainly would have woken up her sons, especially Jeff, who was sleeping just on the other side of the wall. The autopsy report had also come in by then, and it confirmed that Linda had died from strangulation and that she had been sexually assaulted. The medical examiner had also been able to collect a semen sample from Linda's body, which meant they were definitely looking for a male perpetrator here. And since this was now clearly a sexually motivated crime, it meant that anybody Linda had been romantically involved with was now suddenly a top suspect. After speaking with Linda's family, the detectives had discovered that Linda had two serious ex-partners they needed to look at. There was her ex-husband, Frank Slayton, and her more recent ex-boyfriend, a man named Brendan Fowler. Frank, they learned, had apparently abused Linda when they were married, and he was still sending her very threatening letters even now. And Brendan was apparently very possessive and was known to have a bad temper. And Linda had broken up with him just 2 days before her murder. So some officers were already out looking for both of these men to bring them in for questioning. Pickett was eager to get both of their fingerprints. But for now, he was actually more focused on Linda's neighbors. When the detectives had done their initial canvass of the area, the neighbors they spoke to had confirmed that Linda and her younger son Tim were indeed at that party on the night she was killed. And since these neighbors were some of the last people to see Linda alive, they weren't just witnesses, they were also suspects. And so, Pickett had methodically collected fingerprints from all the men who had been at that party, specifically those who didn't have a solid alibi for the period of time after Linda went home. And that's what he was working on now, painstakingly comparing those prints to the clear print he had found on the windowsill. So far, none of them were a match. But they had also gotten blood samples from the neighbors, so Pickett would have to test those as well. In 1981, DNA testing as we know it didn't exist yet. But investigators could figure out somebody's blood type through various bodily fluids. So Pickett and his team could test those blood samples against the genetic material that was found on Linda's body, and at least rule out suspects that way. But Pickett had another, more urgent reason for wanting to be so diligent when it came to testing the people who lived in the complex. It was because, after Linda's murder, just in the last 24 hours, there had been signs that the killer might actually still be in the area. At 3 a.m. that morning, one of Linda's neighbors, a woman who lived just a few doors down, had called the police to report that a stranger had broken into her house. And even though that person was long gone by the time the police arrived, they could see that her back door had clearly been forced open. And then, another neighbor had called in to report that the screen on their window had been pried open as well. None of them were violent assaults like what had happened to Linda, but the timing was extremely suspicious. And it made Pickett wonder if there was a serial predator living right there in the complex. The department had ordered extra patrols in the area, and Pickett was supposed to get fingerprints for whoever they got calls about, so he was working with his police radio on right next to him, waiting for the next call. Pickett leaned back in his chair to give his tired eyes a rest. He knew he was getting pretty exhausted and would need to take a break soon. But just seconds later, a detective barged into the lab and told Pickett they needed him on standby for fingerprinting because they had just brought Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, in for questioning. Moments later, Pickett was standing just outside of an interrogation room, listening as a couple of detectives spoke with Brendan Fowler inside. Even though he couldn't see Brendan, Pickett could tell just by the sound of his voice that he was not happy to be there. He sounded argumentative and very defensive as he insisted over and over that he had absolutely nothing to do with Linda's death. And when he was asked about where he was on the night she died, he had an alibi. He said he was at home with his family, and he stayed there the entire night. He even gave the detectives his mom's phone number and told them they should call her to confirm his story. Pickett heard the detectives inside confer in hushed voices. Then they asked Brendan if he would be willing to take a polygraph test and also let them take his fingerprints. And to Pickett's surprise, Brendan said, "Yeah, go ahead." And as soon as Pickett heard that, he knew from experience that he had to move fast. He went right inside the room and got Brendan's fingerprints before Brendan could change his mind or lawyer up. On September 11th, exactly 1 week after Linda's murder, Pickett sat down at his desk and opened the local newspaper. And what he saw on the front page made him cringe. The Lakeland police chief had just given an interview where he publicly admitted that they would not be making an arrest now or even in the next few days. And reading that in print was a stark reminder to Pickett of just how little progress they had actually made in this case. None of the neighbors' prints had been a match to the one Pickett had lifted off the windowsill. And they had tracked down Linda's ex-husband, Frank, but they found that he was all the way back in Alabama on the night Linda was killed with a solid alibi. As for Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, he had seemed pretty guilty at first. During his polygraph test, the results had come back as inconclusive, which is always a red flag. And his alibi didn't completely check out either. His family had said that he was home at one point on the night Linda was killed, but they had all gone to sleep at some point and couldn't say for sure if maybe he had left the house later that night. But when Pickett had looked at Brendan's fingerprints, he had no choice but to clear him as a suspect. They clearly were not a match to the print from the scene. So now, Pickett knew the entire investigative team was scrambling for new leads, any leads at all. which was why Pickett was not surprised by what he saw when he looked up from his newspaper. He saw a detective leading a suspect out of a precinct interrogation room after clearly questioning him. And it was Linda's own 5-year-old son, Jeff Slayton. And he was obviously crying. Pickett had heard through the grapevine that Jeff was being looked into as a suspect in his own mother's murder and that he had already been questioned a few times. The detectives had started getting interested in him when a few of Linda's family members had mentioned that Jeff and Linda had been fighting a lot in the weeks before she died. And when the investigators looked back at the crime scene photos, they realized that Jeff's cot in the living room shared a wall with Linda's bedroom. So it seemed very strange to them that he hadn't heard a single thing on the night she had died. But as far as Pickett knew, Jeff had a reasonable explanation for all of this. He had said that his fights with his mother were not that serious. He explained that they did fight on the night she died, but it was over a dumb argument about what time they should eat dinner. And he said he had no idea why he didn't wake up when she was attacked. He said he wished he had, so he could have gone in there and tried to help her. And on top of all that, Jeff had taken and passed a polygraph test. But for some reason, it seemed like the investigative team was not done with Jeff yet. And Pickett just sort of felt bad for the kid. He thought it was very unlikely at this point that Jeff was his own mother's killer. Pickett had kids of his own. And from his own experience, the fights Jeff was having with his mom just seemed like typical teenage behavior. Teenagers squabble with their parents. It's pretty normal. And it also just didn't line up with the physical evidence. Pickett was absolutely certain that the attacker had broken in through the window. That didn't make any sense for Jeff if he was sleeping right next door in the living room. And most importantly, Pickett had personally checked Jeff's prints against the one he had lifted from the window, and he knew for a fact that it was not a match. As the days turned into weeks, Pickett was starting to become convinced that the killer might be somebody without a personal connection to Linda. Maybe it was even a complete stranger. He knew that murders by strangers were much more rare than murders committed by a relative, a partner, or a friend, which was why he assumed the other detectives weren't really pursuing that angle. But through his own forensic work, Pickett had now eliminated pretty much everyone in Linda's life who had a clear motive or the opportunity to kill her. And Linda was a very attractive young woman who was also very outgoing. Pickett thought it was entirely possible that the killer could be a stranger who had only interacted with her once, maybe saw her at the store, and then sort of became fixated on her. It seemed plausible. And so after Pickett watched Jeff leave with the detective, he tried to go back to reading his newspaper, but he couldn't focus. He kept thinking about Linda. He had been so sure that this case would be solved quickly by the forensics, by the evidence, but now he wasn't sure if it would be solved at all. And that worry only got stronger and stronger as the months went by, and fewer leads came in. And before long, a whole year had passed. And it was actually time for Pickett to retire. And when he walked out of the precinct for the very last time, he had a pit in his stomach because he had a terrible feeling that without him pushing for it, Linda's case was going to get put on a shelf and eventually forgotten. One afternoon in the fall of 2001, 2 full decades after Linda Slayton was murdered, a detective named Brad Grace sat in his office at the Lakeland Police Department. He was reading over Linda's thick, dusty cold case file. For the last 4 years, Grace had been tasked with sorting through the department's many cold cases and choosing which ones to officially reopen. And this had been a really slow and painstaking process because he had to do all of that while also juggling his active caseload. So even though he'd technically been assigned Linda's case for years, he was just now starting to really dig into it. But the delay didn't worry him too much. Because the whole reason this particular case had appealed to him in the first place was because he was sure he could solve it and solve it quickly. And that was because it had one crucial thing: DNA evidence. Back in 1981, when the murder actually happened, the genetic material that was found on Linda's body was only good for eliminating suspects through their blood type. But now, in 2001, Grace could use that very same material to create a full DNA profile of Linda's killer. and he intended on reaching out to everybody who was involved in the original investigation to get their DNA to test against this new profile. But before he did that, he wanted to completely familiarize himself with all the suspects from 1981. So there was Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, who had abused Linda repeatedly during their marriage. And even though they had been divorced for years, he was apparently still sending her all these threatening letters right around the time of her murder. And then there was her more recent romantic partner, Brendan Fowler, who was known to have a bad temper and seemed to be very controlling of Linda. And they had broken up only 2 days before her murder, so he could have still been furious about it. The neighbors who were at the party Linda had gone to were also suspects. Everybody in that group knew when Linda was heading home, so it was possible somebody could have followed her and then snuck into her bedroom before she went to bed. And then finally, there was Jeff Slayton, Linda's oldest son, who was actually in the house during the murder. His brother Tim had been there too, of course, but Jeff had actually admitted to getting into a big fight with Linda earlier that same day. Now, all of these suspects had been cleared back in the day through fingerprints, alibis, or polygraphs, but Grace knew that DNA testing was way more accurate than any of those old methods of elimination. And so basically, even if they'd been ruled out for one of those three things, a DNA match would override all of that. And so he wasn't going to let these previous eliminations cloud his judgment. He had already decided that no matter what, he was just going to focus on whatever the forensics told him and not be biased by the old investigation. But for now, he just wanted to kick things off by speaking with the two people who had known Linda better than anybody else in the world, her sons, Tim and Jeff. A few days later, Grace walked into a small meeting room at the precinct where he'd been told Jeff and Tim Slayton were waiting for him. And as soon as he saw the two brothers, he just started laughing. Because he realized he already knew Jeff Slayton. They had bowled together in a local league for years. But it had never occurred to Grace that this Jeff Slayton, the victim's son, was the same Jeff from his bowling team. And Jeff recognized Grace at the exact same time. So they spent a little while talking and laughing about what a crazy, small-world coincidence this was. And so when Grace finally sat down with Jeff and with Tim, the atmosphere was already a bit more relaxed. Grace's first line of questioning wasn't about the case at all. It was just personal. He just asked them, hey, how are you guys holding up after all these years? How have you dealt with this horrible thing? And for the next few minutes, the mood in the room got pretty heavy as the two brothers spoke honestly about how terrible the last 20 years had been for them. After their mother had been killed, they both said that they were terrified that they were going to get hurt too. Because the killer was never caught, they always felt like they were looking over their shoulder, wondering who was going to be next. Jeff said he started sleeping with a knife under his pillow. He eventually got so depressed that he dropped out of high school. And Tim admitted that he also struggled a lot, but he took a different path. He relied on his football team and his friends for support. He kept pictures of all of them around his room to remind himself to try and stay positive. After that, the brothers shared what they could remember about the night their mother had died. But it was obvious to Grace that Tim and Jeff didn't really have any new information that he didn't already have inside the case file. So, instead of continuing to question them about the details of the case, Grace explained to them that this murder was going to be solved through DNA. And because of that, he needed to collect DNA samples from every single person who was involved in this case back in the day. And that, he explained, included both of them. The brothers looked surprised for a moment, but then they both nodded and said, "Of course, whatever you need." So Grace stood up and said he would send a lab technician inside to get their samples. But before he left the room, he looked both of them in the eye, and he promised them that he would find their mom's killer. He told them he was not going to retire until he did. Later that month, Grace sat in front of a computer screen in the station's computer lab, reading a police report from 1982. Since speaking to the two Slayton brothers, Grace had collected DNA from dozens of people who were involved in the case. From 1981, he got samples from Jeff, Tim, and also Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, and her ex-boyfriend, Brendan Fowler. He'd also tested the old blood samples that the original investigators had gotten from Linda's neighbors. But none of them, not a single one, matched the DNA profile for Linda's killer. This was hugely disappointing because it meant that Grace had to basically start from scratch. But when he had gone back to the original case notes, he noticed the mention of those other break-ins that had happened around the complex shortly after Linda's murder. And it made him wonder if Linda was killed by a serial predator who was just active in the area at the time. And if that was true, then this person probably would not have just hurt Linda. They would have other victims too. So Grace had run the killer's DNA through the FBI's national database. And when it didn't match anything in there, he had reached out to the local county sheriff's department to see if they could send him any cases from that era that felt similar to Linda's. And they had sent over the very report that he was reading right now. And it felt incredibly promising. In 1982, just a year after Linda's murder, a man named Jimmy Murr was arrested for climbing through a 10-year-old girl's bedroom window and then assaulting and strangling her. And according to his file, Jimmy had a long history of home invasions and very violent behavior. And as soon as Grace finished reading the report, he jumped up from his chair and went to go find one of his officers. He wanted to dig up as much information on this Jimmy Murr as he possibly could and see if maybe they could go track him down. About a month later, Grace sat at his desk, staring at his phone in anxious anticipation. He was waiting for an incredibly important phone call, one that would confirm whether or not Jimmy Murr was Linda's killer. After doing a deep background check on Jimmy, Grace had found out that Jimmy actually knew someone who lived at Linda's complex. And he was literally staying with them at their duplex at the same time Linda was killed. Now, Jimmy himself was not alive anymore, but they had managed to get in touch with his mother, who had agreed to give them her DNA. And they were testing it now. This DNA would not be an exact match to the killer's DNA, of course, but it would show if she was at least a close relative of the killer. And as Grace waited for the lab to call, his heart was pounding in his chest. Because for the first time since he'd picked up Linda's case, everything finally seemed to make sense. Jimmy was a violent serial home invader. He had probably seen Linda while he was staying at his friend's house, and maybe he stalked her for a few days until he saw an opportunity to attack. And then, after he killed her, he must have compulsively kept breaking into other homes in the complex to try and find more victims. It all fit. Just then, his phone rang. Grace snatched it up. He could feel his mouth going dry as he heard it was the lab on the other end of the line. He was going to get his answer right here, right now. But just a second later, they told him the news. It was not a match. Grace's stomach dropped. But he managed to thank them anyway, and he hung up the phone. He couldn't believe it. Despite all the suspects and all the modern forensic evidence that they had, this case was once again at a dead end. Still, Grace kept pushing forward. As the months turned into years, he would regularly find new potential suspects, and he would eventually clear them one by one. He also kept sending the killer's DNA profile to the FBI to run it through their database, just in case any new additions were added in that could be a match. But eventually, over a decade passed by, and Grace still had not been able to match anybody to the killer's DNA. And in 2015, his own health began to decline. And he finally had to make the phone call he hoped he would never have to make. He picked up the phone, and he dialed Jeff Slayton's number. And when Jeff picked up, Grace told him that he had to retire. And that he was sorry, but he still had not found his mother's killer. In June of 2019, 4 years into his retirement, Brad Grace sat on the deck of his Florida home reading a newspaper. He was deep into an article when his cell phone started to ring. And when he looked at the caller ID, he was surprised to see that it was from the Lakeland Police Department. He hadn't gotten a call from them in years. So he immediately picked it up to see what they wanted. And when he did, the person on the other end introduced himself as the detective who had taken over the Linda Slayton case. The detective said they knew Grace was retired now, but they figured he would want to hear this. They said they had hired a genetic genealogist to track down family members of the killer based on that DNA profile that Grace had ordered all those years ago. And through that long and complicated process, they had finally been able to get a match. And after they got the match, they also managed to get the suspect's fingerprints. And those prints, they said, were a perfect match to the palm print that the head of the crime scene unit, Sergeant Edgar Pickett, had taken at the original crime scene 38 years earlier. Grace sat up straight in his chair and listened intently as the detective finally told him who Linda's killer actually was. And when he heard the name, he couldn't believe it. The suspect had been so close the whole time. Based on DNA, forensic evidence, and 38 years of police investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Linda Slayton in the early morning hours of September 4th, 1981. The house was all quiet as the killer waited patiently inside of Linda's closet. Hours earlier, when Linda was out at the party with her son, the killer had removed the screen from her bedroom window and had crept silently inside. And then they had hidden themselves in this closet, waiting for her to come home. The killer had been watching Linda for a while now. They had been finding ways to get close to her and her family. But Linda never really acknowledged them or paid any special attention to them at all. Tonight, though, the killer was determined to show Linda that she was not the one in control. They were. And now, the killer stood in the dark, cramped closet, holding their breath as their heart pounded in their chest. They listened as Linda opened her bedroom door and walked inside. The killer continued to wait anxiously as they heard the quiet sounds of Linda getting ready for bed, getting changed. And then, eventually, they heard the sound of the springs of the bed compressing as Linda laid down to shut her eyes for the night. And then, after the killer was sure Linda was in her bed and the lights were off and it was quiet in the room, they waited even longer, just to make sure that Linda was deeply asleep and that her children were asleep as well. And then finally, when the killer felt like they had waited long enough, they reached up and they grabbed a metal coat hanger off the hook in the closet. And then they burst out of the closet door. And before Linda could do anything, before she could make a sound or even react, she was totally caught off guard. The killer was on top of her, and they had wrapped the coat hanger tight around her throat. Linda struggled. She clawed at her own throat to try and get this thing off of her. But the killer was so much stronger than her, and there was nothing she could do. It didn't take long for the killer to have their way with Linda. And then after they were done, they strangled her until she was dead. And once the killer was finished, they hopped off the bed and just climbed right back out the same window they had come in through, and they wandered off into the night. And the killer would get to replay this crime over and over in their head all day the next day until it was time for football practice. It would turn out that Linda was murdered by her son's football coach, a man named Joseph Mills. Joseph was a fixture in Tim's life. He would drive him to and from practice every single day because Linda didn't have a car. But while Tim saw Joseph as a helpful mentor in his life, Joseph had apparently developed a dark and total fixation on Tim's mother. And during all those trips to her house to drop off her son, Joseph was planning. He was watching. He was figuring out how and when he would attack her. Back in 1981, Joseph Mills was actually interviewed by police over the phone a day after Linda's murder. But he was never really considered an actual suspect. Instead, after Joseph murdered Linda, he just continued to drive her son Tim to and from football practice every day. And Tim would, even very tragically, begin to rely on Joseph for emotional support as he was grieving the loss of his mother. He was confiding in her killer, and he just didn't know. And then, even more tragically, as time went on and Linda's case went cold, one of the pictures that Tim hung up in his bedroom to remind himself to stay positive was a picture of his football team. Tim had no idea that his mother's killer was literally standing right behind him in the back row of that very picture. In December of 2019, Joseph Mills was charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. A chilly and rainy evening in late January of 1965 marks the beginning of the story. In the Lebanonian village of Antelias, which is located just a short distance to the north of Beirut, we are situated on a stretch of shoreline. Furthermore, for a young police officer by the name of Farid Jabber, this evening was about to bring about a sea change in his life. Everything about the weather was terrible. The sand on the beach was transformed into a chilly, dark slush as a result of the continuous and freezing rain that was blowing down. In addition to the deep darkness that was pressing in from all directions, the wind howled in from the sea. The kind of night that would have been ideal for sensible people to be at home, tucked away in their cozy beds. Furthermore, Farid fervently wanted that he was one of its members. While he was out here, strolling along the beach with his companion, he had his jacket drawn over him, but it wasn't doing anything to help him. The chilly air had already penetrated his bones to a great extent. However, Farid was in need of this employment. For someone who lived in a small town like Antelias, being a police officer was more than simply a job. It was a future. Not only did it pay well, but it was also respected, and for Farid, it was the basis around which he was constructing his entire existence with his life. He was responsible for a family and a future that he needed to ensure. There was no way that I could let this position go. In other words, if that meant patrolling a deserted beach in the midst of a winter storm, then that is exactly what he would do without hesitation. He acknowledged that there were going to be aspects of the job that would be quite inconvenient for him. To put it simply, he was completely unaware of how miserable this particular evening was going to become. It was a phone call that brought them out here in the first place. This was the reason why they were here. Someone had called the station a little while ago, and their voice was hurried and a little bit scared because of the situation. They reported that they had saw something peculiar lying on the beach, close to the waterline. Despite the fact that they were unsure of what it was, they thought it appeared to be a person when viewed in the dim light. It is a body. At this point, Antelias was a tranquil location. The occurrence of violent crime was virtually unheard of. There were more than just bodies that were discovered washed up on the strand. In light of this, Farid and his companion were skeptical as they made their way through the sand, their flashlight beams making unsteady circles in the darkness. According to Farid, it was most likely just some trash that had washed up on the shore, or it could have been a gigantic dead marine monster. It was more than anything else that he was irritated. Being called out into this storm for something that was almost certainly going to be of no consequence seemed like a waste of time during that moment. The idea that they were going to discover a human body on the beach was completely out of the question. Then, however, as they continued to stroll, something drew the attention of their lights. A shadowy figure was laying unmoving on the sand at a considerable distance from the beach. It was nothing more than a lump in the darkness, a mere item. Nevertheless, even from a much greater distance, there was an indisputably human quality to its appearance. This was the perfect shape. This was the perfect size. There was an instantaneous disappearance of the annoyance that Farid had been experiencing, and in its stead was a chilly knot of dread in his stomach. This was the end. This is what the person who called came upon. He and his partner shared a glance with one another. They chose not to flee. You do not behave in such manner. You have no idea who or what is waiting for you at this moment. In the event that this was in fact a person, and if something unfortunate had occurred to them, the person responsible might still be in the vicinity, keeping a watchful eye from the rocks or the dunes. They moved at a measured pace as they approached each other carefully. They continued to keep their headlamps on, looking at everything from the breaking waves on one side to the dark and murky dunes on the other side of the region. But there was nobody on the beach. Anything else that was out of place was not present. The only things that could be seen on the sand in front of them were the wind, the rain, and that solitary person. Farid's expertise as a police officer took control as they approached closer, but his mind was still having trouble accepting what his eyes were witnessing. Now, he was able to make out additional details. The physical form of a torso, arms, and legs. This is most certainly a person, he thought to himself. In the sand, there is a body that is resting on its back. On the other hand, there was a peculiarity about it. The manner in which it was laid was not natural in any sense. He was unable to pinpoint exactly what it was, but the proportions did not seem to be quite right. Simply put, the silhouette was unexpected. At long last, the individuals were standing immediately above it. In order to shed light on the situation, they directed both of their flashlight beams downward. And it was at that precise time that Farid realized why the body had appeared to be so peculiar. I have no doubt that it was a person. The body of a man was found there. But he was very lacking in his head. The scene was shocking to see. There was no longer any possibility that the person had drowned by accident or suffered some other kind of catastrophe. The decapitation revealed a story that was both plain and terrible. It was a murderous act. Someone had murdered this man, subjected him to this heinous act, and then either dumped his body on this beach or tossed him into the water so that he would wash up on the coast. The most heinous form of foul play was being committed here. Farid and his companion plunged straight into the process, despite the fact that their hearts were beating extremely fast. It was necessary for them to safeguard the scene. As they drew their service guns, the metal was cold and heavy in their hands, and they conducted a search that was both more extensive and more comprehensive in the local vicinity. There was a search conducted behind the rocks, in the sand dunes, and anywhere else that someone might be hiding. But there was no one present. With the exception of the two of them and the gloomy discovery that was lying at their feet, the beach was entirely quiet and empty. They returned to the body while the rain continued to fall, and the light from their flashlights created a small, isolated bubble of light in the wide blackness that surrounded them. The two of them began conversing, their voices low and intense, as they attempted to determine what their next step would be. Now, you need to keep in mind that this took place in a little community in Lebanon in the middle of the 1960s. Their law enforcement agency was not a large high-tech enterprise that covered a large area. A small force with few resources, they were a formidable adversary. They were unable to call for assistance or notify a forensics team because they did not have radios. They were just unable to provide the kind of comprehensive response that would be expected in the event of a homicide in the modern era. It would be necessary for one of them to really walk all the way back to the station, file a report, and rally the other police in order to initiate any kind of inquiry. It was a laborious and time-consuming process. On top of that, killings were so uncommon in this area that they did not even have a conventional procedure for dealing with them. In a very literal sense, they were making it up as they went along to get what they wanted. As they stood over the body and discussed the various choices available to them, a plan started to take shape. To do so was the only reasonable course of action. It was necessary for one of them to remain here with the body. In order to ensure that the murderer would not return for any reason, they were required to keep a watchful eye on the crime scene and make certain that it was not altered in any way. It would be necessary for the other officer to make the arduous journey back to the station in order to initiate the formal investigation. By the time dawn rolled around, the objective was to have a full team of investigators back here. On the other hand, this meant that one of them would have to spend the entire night on this icy, storm-tossed beach by themselves next to a headless body. The two officers exchanged glances with one another. Both back then and now, it was a rule that was never explicitly stated. All of the challenging tasks are given to the junior man. Farid was the inferior officer in the hierarchy. It was immediately apparent that he was going to be the one to take on this dreadful responsibility. He recalled the things that he had always told himself about this work from the beginning. He was in need of it, despite the fact that it would be uncomfortable. He was in need of the income. It didn't matter how terrible the responsibility was, he couldn't afford to lose his job because he refused to perform it. In response, Farid simply nodded his head as his companion looked at him with a questioning expression on his face. He said, "Fine," with his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm fine. I'll stay here. I'll watch the body. You go get the investigation started. I'll see you in the morning." After his buddy had departed, Farid felt the whole weight of the situation come crashing down on him. His silhouette was swiftly swallowed up by the rain and the darkness. Now he was all by himself. His realization of what he was going to have to accomplish over the next few hours was a terrifying experience. There were other factors at play as well, such as the bitterly low temperatures and the pouring rain. The fact that he was standing guard over a person who had been murdered was the catalyst. This barren expanse of sand was an area that he was sharing with a deceased individual. In addition to that, there was the persistent and nagging fear that was present. There is a possibility that the individual who committed this crime, who murdered this man and severed his head, is still at large. It was true that they had conducted a search, but it was not absolutely certain that the murderer was not hiding someplace close and keeping an eye on him. It was not the cold that caused the shiver to run down his spine, rather it was the thought that caused it. What would happen if they returned? What would happen if they desired to influence the body in a different way? What would happen if they regarded him as a potential danger or a witness who needed to be suppressed? Farid was currently protecting the evidence, but he was also a possible target for the investigation. It was the stuff that nightmares are made of. Still, he made an effort to stabilize himself. Reminding himself that he had been trained as a police officer, he said. In no way was he helpless. He was holding his assigned handgun, which was securely ensconced in its holster. On his belt was the service knife that he carried. If someone did emerge from the shadows with the intention of attacking him, he would be able to protect himself. He was capable of holding his own. This was a mantra that he chanted to himself over and over again in order to combat the fear. The hours passed by glacially. There was never a sign of relief. Farid felt the force of it pressing down on him, and he shook violently. It was expected of him to remain cautious, keeping a watchful eye on the crime scene and being aware. On the contrary, sleep was not even a possibility. On the other hand, he was so miserable, so thoroughly fatigued, and so incredibly cold. In an effort to preserve the meager amount of body heat that he still possessed, he found himself lowering down onto the wet sand, drawing his knees to his chest, and putting his arms around himself. In the midst of this pitiful circumstance, all he was doing was attempting to locate a sliver of solace. And he did that at some point in time. In spite of the fact that he was freezing and terrified, as well as the fact that there was a dead body only a few feet away, he became so comfortable that his body betrayed him. It was somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning when Farid Jabber finally succumbed to sleep. After some time had passed, he suddenly awoke with a start. The pounding of his heart could be felt in his chest. Suddenly, he was overcome with a rush of utter panic. It was immediately apparent to him that he had committed a grave error. It was not appropriate for him to go to sleep. During the course of the inquiry into the murder, he was meant to be protecting the body, which is the single most significant piece of evidence of all. He recalled his anxiety about the possibility that the murderer may return. Additionally, he had just dozed off, leaving the location in a state of utter vulnerability. His thoughts were racing as he struggled to get to his feet. His eyes swept the area. It was still dark, it was still raining, and the temperature was quite chilly. His flashlight was directed at the location where the body was supposed to be, and he turned around to face it. And there was no one present at the location. The physique had vanished. Fear was his first instinct, and it was pure and basic. The perpetrator of the crime was present. It is likely that they sneaked up on him while he was sleeping and managed to steal his body. Perhaps they are still in the vicinity. Without thinking, he grabbed for his firearm, and his hand went to the holster that was attached to his hip. But the only thing his fingertips discovered was leather that was empty. He had his revolver removed from his holster, which was exposed. Suddenly, the horror was a reality now. He had been left to watch a crime scene, and in the span of a few hours, he had been able to disarm himself and find the body of the person who had been murdered. It was the end of his career. This man was a shame. However, at this moment, his primary priority was to ensure his own survival. Even though the murderer had been here close enough to steal his pistol, it is possible that he is still keeping an eye on him. Thankfully, he was still in possession of his knife. He removed it from its sheath, the blade shining brightly in the dim light that was present. Only that was left for him to do. He gripped it firmly while his eyes darted around the beach, which was at night. Where do I begin? Frantically, he pondered about it. Do you know where the body is? Where can I find my firearm? As soon as he realized the dreadful truth, his mind began searching for plausible reasons, anything other than the truth. Perhaps it was an animal, he pondered. Perhaps a giant animal emerged and pulled the body away from the scene. Through the use of his flashlight, he searched the sand for any signs of drag marks. In contrast, there was nothing. Although part of it would have been washed away by the rain, there ought to have been some evidence of it. Aside from that, what kind of animal would remove a handgun from its holster after carefully unclipping it? It was completely illogical. After then, he had another thought. The current. It's possible that a strong wave had collided with the shore, snatched the body, and then dragged it back out into the ocean. Both the absence of drag marks and the fact that it had vanished would be explained by this. But he looked at the spot where he had been resting, which was only a few feet away from the location where the body had been. In the event that a wave that was large enough to move the body of a fully grown man had come up, it would have most certainly hit him as well. It would have saturated him while simultaneously waking him up in an instant. Once more, it did not provide an explanation for the missing gun. A gun that was protected by a holster could not be removed by a wave. At long last, the horrifying realization entered the picture. One answer was the only one that could account for all of the data. Someone had arrived at this location while he was sleeping. A person had picked up the body and relocated it to a different location. During the time that he was sleeping, someone had reached over him and seized his gun. For the entirety of the night, he had been dreading the worst-case scenario, and it had finally come true. The perpetrator of the crime had made his return, and he had slept through it all. It was earlier that night, before Fareed and his partner had even arrived, and this is what had actually taken place earlier that evening. An individual by the name of Habib Jabber, who was Fareed's own cousin, had been strolling down the beach by himself. Perhaps he was just going for a walk to get his thoughts organized, but we don't know for sure why he was there. On the other hand, he was assaulted while he was there. A person ambushed him with the intention of robbing him. The thief ended up killing Habib after something went wrong, which led to a struggle between the two of them. Next, the murderer severed Habib's head, either out of a state of fear or possibly for some other more sinister motive. Although he left his headless body on the sand, he removed the head of Habib as well as the money that he had stolen, and then he returned to his home, which was located in close proximity to the beach. However, after a few hours had passed, the murderer began to feel anxious as he was sitting in his home. He was sorry for his error. The decision to abandon the body was a poor one. It was a substantial piece of evidence that could be identified as belonging to him with relative ease. His decision was that he needed to return. The body needed to be retrieved and disposed of in the appropriate manner, and he needed to get rid of all the evidence for good. So he walked back to the beach, which was the location where the crime had occurred. On the other hand, when he arrived, he witnessed something that caused his blood to turn ice cold. Not only was the body no longer by itself, it was now being protected by a law enforcement officer. Fareed Jabber, the victim's cousin, was the officer who was responsible for the murder, even though the perpetrator was unaware of this fact. It is essential to comprehend that Fareed was unaware of the identity of the victim during the entirety of this narrative. All he was aware of was the fact that a man had been killed in the incident. It was impossible for him to identify the body as belonging to his own cousin, Habib, because the head was missing from the body. The only thing he thought was that it was a stranger. Now, when the murderer noticed Fareed standing watch, his initial reaction was to turn around and flee the dangerous situation. It was a failure of his plan. It was impossible for him to reach the body. However, he made the decision to creep a little bit closer in order to observe what was taking place. In addition, while he observed the scene from the shadows, he came to an astounding realization. It was discovered that Farid, the police officer, had slept off while on the job. He was given the opportunity. Keeping a low profile, the murderer approached the scene of the crime in complete silence. During the time that Farid was sleeping, he picked up the body of Habib and carried it away, heading back towards his house at the extremity of the beach. Following that, he returned for a second time. It was then that he realized Farid, who was still asleep, had a service weapon concealed in his holster. This was an opportunity that he simply could not let go of. With great care and in complete silence, he removed the clip from the holster, eased the revolver out, and then took it as well. The fact that Farid was outwitted and disarmed by the murderer while he was sleeping is, in all actuality, the worst thing that he could have possibly imagined happening to him. The killer had now brought the body, the head, and Farid's gun back to his house, which was located farther down the beach. In his latest scheme, he intended to ignite a massive fire and destroy everything. The evidence should be completely destroyed. As a result, he began making preparations. Immediately, he reached for an axe and started chopping up firewood right there at the edge of the beach, not too far away from where Farid was resting. At that very instant, when the murderer was chopping wood, Farid awoke in a condition of complete and utter panic, having come to the realization that both his body and his pistol had vanished entirely. He was in a state of utter desperation. Eventually, he was able to spot him despite the rain. Chopping wood is a man who may be seen at the very end of the beach. This man was completely unknown to Farid at this point. There was no doubt in his mind that he was unaware that this was the individual who had just committed the murder of his cousin and taken his service weapon. In Farid's eyes, this was nothing more than a man who lived in the neighborhood. Farid's head, however, was filled with an idea as he struggled to find a solution. He lives in such close proximity to the location of the incident. Possibly, he witnessed something. Perhaps he picked up on something. Assuming he was able to assist him in locating the deceased individual and his firearm, he might be able to save his career. As a result, Farid began going along the beach while holding his own service knife. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was about to come face to face with the person who had murdered his cousin. Let's fast forward a few hours to the morning of the following day. At long last, the storm had subsided, and a light that was a light gray in color was seen spreading across the sky. Farid's companion went back to the shore, and this time he wasn't wandering about by himself. Additionally, he was accompanied by a small group of investigators who were prepared to initiate the official investigation. As they got closer to the location, his companion peered down the beach and noticed a solitary individual standing on the sand near to what appeared to be a decapitated body lying on the ground. In the beginning, he experienced a rush of relief. First, there was Farid, and then there was the body, he thought to himself. The scene is safe to be in. The appearance is exactly the same as it was when I left it. However, as they became closer to one another, the partner began to become aware of things that were not right. Squinting, he attempted to make sense of what he was seeing by focusing his eyes. It was wearing the improper clothes when the body was found lying on the ground. The victim had been wearing clothes that were completely different from what they had been wearing the previous evening. He had no doubts about it. Where did this place come from? This intriguing disparity was just the beginning of the situation. When the partner and the detectives eventually arrived at the body and got a close look at it, it was impossible to deny why they had found it. This was not the same body that had been found the previous evening. The clothing was not the only factor. Someone else was the one in question. Despite the fact that the partner was unaware of it at the time, this was not the body of Farid's cousin. However, it was determined that it was not Farid's body. At that very moment, Farid was standing right there next to it, seeming pale and very fatigued. In point of fact, it would come out that the scene that morning appeared to be was almost entirely different from what it actually was. Together with the detectives, the partner was required to spend the remainder of the day conducting a thorough investigation of the entire beach as well as the village that was adjacent to it. They also had to conduct dozens of interviews with anyone who might have seen or heard anything. Piece by excruciating piece, they pieced together the story in a slow and methodical manner. And because the fact that they discovered was so odd and so perverted, it would soon become a topic of discussion in newspapers all across the world. For the reason that Farid had approached the man who was chopping wood when he was walking down that beach, he was so overwhelmed by his desire to keep his work that he had approached him. When he had questioned him if he had seen anything weird, he had inquired as to whether or not he knew what had happened to the body that had been there just a few hours before. Undoubtedly, the man pretended to be a fool. Yes, he was the murderer. He had no intention of admitting guilt. In addition, while they were standing there conversing, Farid's thoughts started to construct a new concept that was extremely dreadful. His life was ruined. It was the end of his career. But then, he turned his attention to this stranger, this man who was standing on a beach that was completely empty. Nobody else was in the vicinity. Not a single witness was present. Farid was still in possession of his knife. During that time of complete and utter dread and the need to protect himself, he made a terrible decision. In his mind, he pondered, what if I simply replace the body? Nobody will ever be aware of it. That is just what Farid did in this situation. It was with his knife that he attacked the man, and he ended up killing him. After that, in a gruesome reiteration of the initial act, he severed his head from his body and dragged it back to the beach where it had been at the beginning. In an effort to save his own employment, he was attempting to construct the scenario in such a way that it appeared as though nothing had changed. When his colleague and the cops came, he was standing there close to the body of the man he had just killed. He had only just finished killing him. He was going to act as if he had been watching over the situation during the entire night. However, Farid had no way of knowing that the random man he picked to kill in order to cover up his error was not at all a random man. He had no means of knowing this beforehand. It was the same individual who had just a few hours earlier been responsible for the death of his cousin, Habib. It was completely unknown to Farid. When he was trying to save himself, he believed that he was killing a total stranger. However, in a surprising and inexplicable turn of events, he had genuinely and unintentionally avenged the death of his cousin. Nevertheless, the fact that justice had been delivered in a convoluted and circuitous manner did not alter the reality of the situation. Even yet, Farid Jabber had committed the heinous crime of murdering a man. He was taken into custody for the crime of murder. His frantic effort to rescue his work had not only been unsuccessful, but it had also transformed him into a murderer himself, destroying the very life that he had been so terrified of losing. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time, what's up? On the evening of the 28th of December 2016, a 54-year-old man named Don Fluitt was driving his truck down a highway heading into the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. The lights of the city were just beginning to glow against the darkening desert sky. Next to him, his 11-year-old daughter Sienna was fast asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window. They had been on the road for nearly 12 hours, a long, quiet drive all the way from his mother's home in California. They had just spent Christmas there. But it hadn't really been a very happy holiday. A few weeks earlier, Don's sister Janice had passed away from breast cancer. And Janice was one of the last truly close family members Don had left. His father was gone, his other sister was gone too, and he wasn't even on speaking terms with his younger brother, Dennis. They'd had a huge argument the year before, and things had never been the same. So when Don got the news about Janice, he knew he had to be with his mom. He immediately called his ex-wife and arranged to take Sienna with him for the trip. He really wished they could have stayed in California a little longer, but he had to get back to work. Don worked at an agency that provided services for people who were developmentally disabled, and there was a big, important meeting coming up that he just could not miss. His job was important to him. It was a way of giving back, of doing good in the world, something he had come to value more and more over the years. Just then, the brake lights of the car in front of him flashed bright red. Don slammed on his own brakes, bringing the truck to a sudden stop. Traffic was piling up, everything grinding to a halt for no apparent reason. He felt that old, familiar surge of anger rise up in his chest. It was a hot, prickly feeling he knew all too well. He laid on the horn, a long, frustrated blast. He was just about to roll down the window to yell something at the driver in front of him, but then he glanced over at Sienna. She had opened her eyes, startled by the sudden stop and the noise. Seeing the alarm on her face was enough to make him stop. He took a deep breath. He reminded himself that it was just traffic. It wasn't worth getting angry about. Don used to have a pretty bad temper when he was behind the wheel, a real case of road rage. But in recent years, he'd been working really hard to control it. He wanted to set a better example for his daughter. So he just sat there, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for the traffic to move. Finally, the cars ahead started to inch forward. As he rounded an exit off the highway and drove through the familiar streets of downtown Albuquerque, Don made a conscious effort to shift his focus to something positive. He thought about the upcoming weekend. It was already Wednesday, which meant it was only a few more days until Spaghetti Sunday. And the thought of Spaghetti Sunday always made Don smile. It was a tradition he and Sienna had started together a few years back. Every Sunday, right after church, they would go home and cook up huge batches of spaghetti and meatballs. Then they'd pack it all up and take it downtown to feed the homeless community. At first, it had just been the two of them, a father and daughter with a big pot of pasta. But, over time, word had spread. More people had started to join in, bringing their own food or dropping off donations of clothes and canned goods. Before long, it had grown into a real community event, with whole groups of volunteers showing up every week. Don was so proud of what he'd created, but he was especially proud that he had done it with Sienna, teaching her the importance of kindness and compassion. Finally, Don turned down his own quiet residential street. He pulled into the garage of a 2-story stucco townhouse. It was still decorated with Christmas lights, their cheerful colors a little out of place with the sadness he was feeling. He turned off the engine, and the garage fell silent. He got out of the car, woke Sienna up gently, and then grabbed their suitcases from the back. They walked to the front door, and he fumbled for his keys in his pocket. He unlocked the door, and as his daughter stepped inside, she let out a huge shriek of pure excitement. Don smiled. Waiting for her right there under the Christmas tree was a brand new bicycle, a shiny bow tied to the handlebars. She spun around, her eyes wide, and asked if she could please take it for a spin around the block right now. Don wanted to say yes. He loved seeing her so happy. But it was already dark outside, and this was only supposed to be a quick stop. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost 7 o'clock. He'd already had Sienna for most of December, including the whole holiday week, and he was supposed to get her back to her mother's house soon. Don and his ex-wife, Christine White, had a civil relationship for the most part, but he knew she'd be annoyed if he was late or if he tried to ask for more time. They had a schedule, and it was important to stick to it. So, Don told Sienna the bike would have to wait. He promised they could ride it all weekend. For now, he just needed her to go grab whatever she needed from her room, and then they would head out. As Sienna ran upstairs, Don noticed something strange. His golden retriever, Buddy, hadn't come to greet him. Normally, the dog would be all over him, tail wagging, jumping up the second he heard the key in the door. It was unusual. So, Don walked through the living room and down the hall, calling out Buddy's name. He finally found the dog cowering in the master bedroom, tucked away in a corner. Don extended his hand, and Buddy came forward, but he was skittish, sniffing his hand cautiously. This was really unnerving for Don. Buddy never acted scared of him. But then again, Don had been gone for a while. He told himself it was probably just separation anxiety. The dog missed him. So, he gave Buddy a gentle pat on the head, made sure his bowl was full of kibble, and then grabbed his keys again. It was time for the short drive over to Christine's house. Don drove very slowly through the neighborhood, trying to savor every last minute with Sienna. He treasured this time with his daughter more than anything. The mistakes he'd made when he was younger had almost cost him the chance to be her father. These days, Don lived a squeaky clean life. He went to church every Sunday, he ran his charity, he was a pillar of the community. But it hadn't always been that way. He had partied a lot in his youth. When Sienna was just a toddler, he'd had his dream job as a firefighter, but he'd lost it after failing a drug test. After he lost that job, the financial strain on his marriage to Christine became too much. She had to shoulder most of the bills, and the resentment built up. After a few months, Christine filed for divorce. It was a crushing blow for Don. But what was even worse was the possibility of losing Sienna. Don already had 2 older kids from a previous marriage. After that divorce, his first wife had been given sole custody, and she had moved them all to Oklahoma. As a result, Don had barely seen them while they were growing up. It was one of the biggest regrets of his life. He was absolutely determined not to let that happen again with Sienna. So, he'd gone to court. He fought Christine and her new husband, Terry White, for shared custody. The court battle had gotten ugly at times, really contentious, but in the end, it was worth it. Don made the most of every single moment he got to spend with his daughter. He was the dad who would braid her hair before school. He was the dad who would stay up late making elaborate costumes for her school plays. And on the nights when she was at her mom's house, he never, ever forgot to call her before bed to say goodnight. Now, Don pulled into Christine and Terry's driveway. Christine was already outside, standing by the front door with her arms crossed. As he got out of the car, she pointedly motioned to her watch. She was clearly annoyed that he was late. Don walked over and sort of apologized, explaining that it had been a really long drive from California. He told her they'd only stopped a few times for gas and bathroom breaks, and then they'd hit all that traffic coming into the city. Christine just sighed and said it was okay. She asked how the trip was, and Don told her it went as well as it could. They'd had a nice Christmas despite the sadness hanging over everything because of his sister's death. He said it had been meaningful just for the family to be together. Before Sienna ran inside the house, Don pulled her in for a big hug and a kiss. He told her he loved her and promised to call her before bed, just like always. And he reminded her that when he saw her again that weekend, they would have plenty of time to test drive that new bike. When Don pulled back into his own garage just 10 minutes later, he noticed that the big plastic trash can at the end of his driveway was lying on its side, overturned. He figured the wind must have knocked it over. So he parked his truck, got out, and walked down to the curb to flip it upright. Then he walked back up the driveway, pressed the button on the wall to close the garage door, and unlocked the interior door that led into his townhouse. As he was inside, taking off his shoes and his jacket, he could have sworn he heard the garage door stop closing. He thought he heard it start to roll back up again, as if something had maybe tripped the safety sensor at the bottom. He paused, listening intently. And then what he heard was the sound of the door closing again, this time hitting the concrete floor with a soft thud. He shook his head. He must have been imagining things. He was tired from the long drive. His mind was playing tricks on him. Don dragged his suitcase into his bedroom and started to unpack. All he wanted to do was just relax and try not to think about anything for a while. But when he carried his toiletries into his bathroom to put them away, he looked up and saw a small, ugly hole in the ceiling. He let out a frustrated sigh. Don had been hounding his landlord about patching that hole for months. He had really been hoping it would finally be done by the time he got home. He made a mental note to give the landlord yet another angry call about it in the morning. When he was finally finished unpacking, Don put his jacket and his shoes back on. He headed out to the garage to have a cigarette before bed. It was his routine, a quiet moment to himself at the end of a long day. The following morning, on December 29th, at the office where Don worked, his coworker, Valerie Torres, was settling down at her desk with a cup of coffee when her phone rang. Valerie picked it up. It was Don's daughter, Sienna, on the other line. Sienna sounded worried. She told Valerie that her dad hadn't called her last night to say goodnight. She asked if he was there at the office now. Valerie stood up and peered over the cubicle wall at Don's desk. It was empty. His computer was off. This was a little unusual. Don was a very punctual guy. He was always one of the first people in the office. But it was still early. So she told Sienna not to worry. She said she would give Don a call right now, and she was sure he would call Sienna right back as soon as he got the message. Valerie hung up and dialed Don's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. That was also strange. So she sent him a text message, just asking if everything was okay. She waited. But after half an hour, Don still hadn't replied. He hadn't shown up at the office either. And now, Valerie was starting to feel a real sense of concern. It was not like Don to just skip work without calling in. And it was definitely not like him to ignore calls and texts, especially if he knew his daughter was trying to reach him. Valerie discussed it with another coworker, and they both agreed that something felt wrong. They decided to just go swing by Don's townhouse themselves and check on him. Maybe he had just overslept, or maybe his phone had died. They hoped it was something simple. The sky over Don's townhouse was dark and cloudy as Valerie pulled into the driveway. She and her coworker got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Valerie knocked, but to her surprise, the door just swung open under the pressure of her hand. It hadn't been latched properly. She looked over at her coworker, a nervous expression on her face. Then the two of them cautiously stepped inside. Valerie immediately called out Don's name, but there was no answer. The house was quiet. So she started to wander through the living room, peeking into the bedroom on the first floor. The house seemed empty. Her coworker, meanwhile, headed up the stairs to look for Don on the second floor. Valerie decided she would check the garage to see if maybe Don's truck was there. If the truck was gone, maybe he just had an early morning appointment he forgot to mention. Valerie opened the door that led from the kitchen into the two-car garage. She flipped on the light switch. The fluorescent bulbs flickered on, and she saw Don's truck parked in its usual spot. But as her eyes scanned the garage, something else caught her attention. On the back wall of the garage, behind the neighbor's SUV that also parked in the shared space, she noticed a streak of something dark red. It ran down the wall. At this point, Valerie's heart started to pound in her chest. She was feeling pretty nervous, but she knew she had to see what it was. She began walking slowly toward that back wall, her eyes fixed on the dark streak. She was wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her, if it was just paint or rust. As she got closer and closer, the streak came into sharper focus. Finally, she was close enough that she could actually look down into the narrow space between the back of the SUV and that red-streaked wall. And when she looked down, she screamed. A little before noon on that same day, an Albuquerque police detective named Matthew Kaplan pulled his unmarked car up in front of a two-story stucco townhouse. The whole property was already secured with yellow crime scene tape, and police officers were swarming the area. Two women in business clothes were sitting on the curb, their faces stained with tears and smeared makeup. All Detective Kaplan knew so far was that a man had been found dead in the garage attached to this townhouse. And now, he was the lead investigator on the case. So, he got out of his car and walked up to the open front door. A uniformed officer standing in the entryway filled him in on a few more of the details. The victim had been identified as Dawn Flewitt. The two women sitting outside were his coworkers. They had come here to check on him when he hadn't shown up for work that morning. The officer also told him there were no signs of forced entry. The women had said the front door was unlocked, just slightly ajar when they arrived. Kaplan stepped inside the townhouse, into the living room. The first thing he saw was a brand new bicycle sitting under a Christmas tree. It looked like it hadn't even been ridden yet. Then he did a slow, methodical loop through the first and second floors. He noted there was a cell phone lying on the couch and a wallet on the kitchen counter full of cash and credit cards. It didn't look like anything had been rifled through. None of the drawers in the house were hanging open. The place was generally neat and orderly. On first glance, this did not appear to Kaplan to be a robbery gone wrong. Back on the first floor, Kaplan pushed open the door to the garage. Crime scene techs were already busy inside, their cameras flashing as they photographed the scene and collected forensic samples. Kaplan carefully stepped around them and knelt down next to Dawn's body. It was lying face up, wedged in the small space between an SUV and the back wall. Dawn's throat had been cut. It was a gaping wound that ran from one side of his neck to the other. There were also smaller cuts and scrapes near his eye, on his ear, and on his hands, defensive wounds, as if he had tried to fight back against his attacker. There were also clear signs of blunt force trauma to his head, as if he had been hit repeatedly with a heavy object, something like a baseball bat or maybe just a fist. And when Kaplan looked very closely at Dawn's eyes, he saw tiny red dots, burst capillaries on his eyeballs and eyelids. He knew from experience that these were commonly a sign of strangulation. This killing was unusually violent, almost overkill. It was gruesome. And Kaplan knew that kind of rage usually meant the murder was personal. Kaplan stood up to examine the rest of the scene. There was blood spattered on the walls and on a small refrigerator that stood next to the body. There were also bloody handprints smeared on the side of Dawn's own truck. But there was no large pool of blood on the concrete floor around Dawn's body. In fact, the floor looked strangely clean. It looked like somebody had recently mopped it, like they had tried to clean up the blood afterwards. That's when Kaplan noticed an empty plastic bottle of bleach sitting on top of the washing machine nearby. His eyes narrowed. He walked over, he opened up the lid of the washer, and sure enough, he found a pile of wet towels inside. They still smelled strongly of bleach. The killer had stayed. They had taken the time to try and clean the scene. Just then, a crime scene tech came over, carrying a bottle of luminol spray. Luminol is a chemical that law enforcement uses to detect trace amounts of blood even after it's been cleaned up. It reacts with the iron and hemoglobin and glows a faint blue in the dark. Kaplan stepped back so the tech could spray the area. He followed him as he made his way through the garage and then back into the house. The luminol spray did indeed pick up traces of blood on the kitchen floor and inside the kitchen sink. Kaplan figured the suspect had tried to clean up the crime scene in the garage, and then they had come inside to wash their hands, or maybe even the murder weapon, in the kitchen sink before they left. But it's much, much harder to completely scrub a murder scene than most people realize. And so as Kaplan left the house, he was feeling fairly hopeful that the crime scene techs would eventually be able to recover some of the killer's DNA from the scene. Kaplan stepped out through the front door just as another car pulled up and parked at the end of the driveway. A man got out of the car, looking agitated. He pushed right past the yellow crime scene tape, and Kaplan immediately put his hands up to stop him. The man looked totally flustered. He introduced himself as Benny Ruiz, the landlord. He asked what on earth the police were doing on his property. When Kaplan told Benny that his tenant, Dawn Fluitt, had been murdered, Benny gasped. Then he started talking a mile a minute. He said Dawn was a devoted father, a deeply religious man who would open up his home to anyone. He said that nobody would ever want to kill Dawn. But then Benny paused. He made a face, like a thought was just occurring to him. And he said that, actually, there was one lead he could think of. He told Kaplan that Dawn did a lot of charity work with the city's homeless population. And he said it was possible that maybe somebody from the street could have followed Dawn home, broken into his house, and killed him. After Kaplan finished talking to Benny and sent him on his way, he just stood on Dawn's driveway, thinking about what the landlord had said. Based on the extreme violence of the murder and the fact that nothing of value appeared to have been stolen, he doubted very much that this was just a random break-in by a homeless person. He thought it was much more likely that Dawn's killer was someone Dawn knew. Maybe even someone who had a key to the house, based on the fact that there was no evidence of forced entry. And since Dawn was a big, muscular guy, and it was clear from the defensive wounds that he had fought back hard against his attacker, Kaplan figured he was probably looking for a strong, potentially large male suspect. The question was, who would want to kill Dawn Fluitt? From what the landlord and the two coworkers had said, Dawn seemed to be a really stand-up guy. If he had any dark secrets, they were very well hidden. The next day, December 30th, Detective Kaplan drove to the house of Dawn's ex-wife, Christine White, and her husband, Terry White. Kaplan had already spoken to Christine on the phone the day before just to break the terrible news about her ex-husband's death and to see if she had any idea who might have done this. Christine hadn't had any specific ideas about who would want to hurt Dawn, but she had mentioned that he used to have a big problem with road rage. She pointed out that he had just finished a 12-hour drive, so maybe, she suggested, he had gotten into some kind of confrontation with another driver on the highway, and maybe they had gotten angry enough to follow him home. But she also said their daughter Sienna had been with him for the whole drive, and Sienna hadn't mentioned anything like that happening. The only other thing Christine could think of was that Dawn had told her his dog Buddy was acting really skittish and scared when he had gotten back from the road trip. Kaplan had quickly ruled out Christine herself as a suspect. She had an airtight alibi. Dawn had dropped Sienna off at her house around 7:45 on the night he was killed, and Christine and Sienna had spent the rest of the night together, at home. Her road rage theory seemed about as unlikely as the landlord's theory that a random homeless person had broken in. And the information about the dog was interesting, but it wasn't particularly helpful in identifying a suspect right now. But Kaplan was back at Christine's house today because he still needed to speak to her husband, Terry. Terry had been out of town for work the night before. He was a truck driver and often worked long shifts at odd hours. But as the husband of Dawn's ex-wife, he was a natural person of interest. When Kaplan rang the doorbell, Terry opened the door and greeted the detective with a polite, easy smile. Kaplan entered the living room where Christine and Sienna were sitting. He said a quick hello to them and then asked if they could leave so he could speak to Terry in private. Terry sat down in a big armchair across from Kaplan. He seemed very calm, almost relaxed, and he was friendly as he told the detective that he and Dawn didn't really have much contact with each other. He said their relationship wasn't exactly bad, it was just awkward. He explained it was because of the very difficult custody battle Dawn had had with Christine a few years back. Ever since then, Terry said he'd tried to keep the peace by just sort of avoiding Dawn as much as possible. He said he knew that Sienna loved her dad like crazy, and if he accidentally sparked some kind of conflict with Dawn, Sienna would likely take her dad's side, and he didn't want that. As for the night of Dawn's murder, Terry told Kaplan that he was at his sister's house until about 9 o'clock that evening. Then he left her place and stopped at a Wendy's on his way to work to grab a burger. After that, he said he took a nap in the cab of his truck in the company parking lot before going in for his overnight shift. After Kaplan left Terry and Christine's house, he went back to the station. He immediately called Terry's sister, and then he called Terry's boss at the trucking company. And they both confirmed Terry's story. His sister said he left her house around 9. His boss confirmed he clocked in for his shift later that night. It seemed that Terry's alibi was solid. And that meant Kaplan was right back to square one with no viable suspects. But while he was sitting at his desk, writing up a report on Terry's interview, his phone rang. It was a call from one of Dawn's neighbors. She told him she had been looking over the footage from her home security camera for the night of Dawn's murder, and she had found something that she thought the detective might want to see. Kaplan stopped writing his report mid-sentence. He grabbed his keys and drove right over to the neighbor's house. She led him inside to her computer and pressed play on a video file. Kaplan leaned in close to the computer screen. He watched the grainy black and white footage. The camera was mounted on her house, and it showed the side of Dawn's townhouse shot from the top of her driveway next door. At 7:41 p.m., which Kaplan knew was just a few minutes after Dawn and Sienna had left for Christine's house, a dark, hooded figure could be seen in the corner of the frame. The figure walked over and deliberately tipped over Dawn's trash can. Then the figure walked up the driveway toward Dawn's garage and disappeared from the screen, presumably hiding somewhere out of view. About 15 minutes later, the video showed Dawn's truck pulling into the garage. Then it showed Dawn walking back out again to go pick up the overturned trash can. He set it upright, and then he walked back up the driveway. Now, the garage door itself was not in the camera's frame, but the camera did capture a faint glow of light coming from inside Dawn's garage. Kaplan could see that light start to dim, which meant the garage door was closing. But then, inexplicably, the light began to get bigger again, which meant the door must have started going back up. And at the exact same time, there were several brief flashes of light, like a strobe. And then, after those flashes, the light began to dim again, meaning the garage door finally closed all the way, eventually leaving the driveway in total darkness. Kaplan got a copy of this video from the neighbor. Then he left her house and walked over to Dawn's, trying to piece together what he had just seen on that video. He stood inside of Dawn's empty garage and held the garage door clicker in his hand. He pressed the button to close the door. And as the heavy door began its descent, Kaplan walked closer and closer until he was standing almost directly underneath its path. And when he did that, all of a sudden, the door stopped. Kaplan had tripped the infrared safety sensor at the bottom. And as soon as he tripped that sensor, a light on the motor unit at the top of the garage flashed 3 times, just as the door not only stopped, but reversed direction and began going back up. It was clearly the system's safety feature. And once he saw that, Kaplan thought about those strange flashes of light he had seen in the neighbor's video. And he thought about that hooded figure he had seen lurking near the garage just moments before Dawn got home. And all at once, it was like the pieces of the puzzle just clicked into place. The suspect must have waited for Dawn to go inside. And then, as the garage door was closing, they must have tried to sneak into the garage. But when they did, they must have tripped that sensor. So, the door would have stopped, those lights would have flashed, and the door would have started to go back up again. But the suspect, not wanting Dawn to realize what was going on, must have rushed over to the control panel on the wall and quickly hit the button again to make the door shut all the way. It was a close call for the killer. And it meant Dawn was none the wiser that someone else was now in the garage with him. Unfortunately, as valuable as this footage was, Kaplan was not able to make out the dark figure's face on the security video. It was too grainy and the person was wearing a hood. But the video had given him a few extremely valuable clues. Whoever killed Dawn must have known his routine. They must have known when he would be leaving to take Sienna to her mother's house, and they must have known approximately when he would be coming back home alone. And they also must have known that Dawn was the type of person who, when he pulled into his driveway and saw that overturned trash can, wouldn't just ignore it and leave it for the morning. They knew he would deal with it right then and there. And while Dawn was down at the curb, busy with the trash can, that would give the killer the perfect opportunity to sneak into the garage undetected. And all of this meant that the suspect didn't just know Dawn, they had to have known him very, very well. Detective Kaplan spent the next several weeks speaking to absolutely everyone who knew Dawn. He talked to his coworkers, his friends from church, and his entire extended family. He even tracked down his first wife and the 2 kids he shared with her, Tiffany and Josh, who had gone to live in Oklahoma with their mom after the divorce. When Kaplan reached the kids, who were now young adults, they said that they had mostly stayed on good terms with their dad over the years. However, they said that wasn't true for some of the other members of their family. They told Kaplan that the person he should really be investigating was Dawn's own brother, Dennis. They said that Dawn and Dennis had had a huge falling out about a year earlier. But somehow, right after Dawn's death, Dennis had gotten the keys to Dawn's townhouse, and he'd been out there boxing things up and basically taking control over all of Dawn's affairs ever since. Now, Dennis was apparently telling the rest of the family that he was just trying to be helpful. But Tiffany and Josh, they weren't sure they believed that. Towards the end of January of 2017, nearly a month after Dawn was murdered, Detective Kaplan brought Dawn's brother, Dennis, into the Albuquerque police station for questioning. Seated across the bare interrogation table, Dennis seemed a little keyed up. He was fidgety, but Kaplan couldn't tell whether he was nervous about the interview because he was guilty or just irritated about it because he was innocent and being hassled. Dennis told Kaplan that the feud between him and his brother had started after their father had passed away in October of 2015, a little over a year earlier. He said the family had reached an agreement about what to do with their dad's possessions. But Don had apparently violated that agreement by keeping one of their father's classic cars for himself instead of selling it and splitting the money like they had all agreed. The argument had spiraled from there, and pretty soon, Dennis said he and Don were no longer on speaking terms at all. Dennis claimed that he had reached out to Don that fall and tried to reconnect, but he said Don never returned his calls. Dennis said he had hoped that at some point they could patch things up if they just tried a little bit harder. But then Dennis said he had gotten the call that Don was dead. Kaplan narrowed his eyes as Dennis finished his explanation. He didn't really buy the whole reconciliation story. And Dennis's only alibi for the night of the murder was that he was home alone. That wasn't an alibi at all. So Kaplan decided to push him a little harder. He asked Dennis why he had started rooting through Don's house the very minute the crime scene tape came down. At this, Dennis began to get pretty defensive. He insisted he only wanted to spare the rest of his family the pain of having to go through his brother's things themselves. Besides, he said, his hard work settling Don's affairs had actually led him to a new lead about the murder, a lead that he wanted Kaplan to look into. He said that just a few days after the murder, he'd walked into Don's house and found the landlord, Benny Ruiz, just standing there inside, with no good explanation for what he was doing. Dennis said he had heard from Don's neighbors that Don and this landlord had been going back and forth over some hole in the ceiling that the landlord was supposed to repair, but hadn't gotten around to yet. And Dennis just thought it was extremely odd that Benny would just walk into an active crime scene, even if he did technically own the place. Kaplan sat back in his chair. He remembered Benny Ruiz showing up at the house on the day Don's body was found. Benny had been very quick to suggest, without any evidence at all, that maybe a homeless person could have broken in and murdered Don. Maybe, Kaplan thought now, Benny had just been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself from the very beginning. The next day, Kaplan brought Benny Ruiz, the landlord, into the station for an interview. Just like Don's brother Dennis, Benny did not have a solid alibi for the night Don was killed. He said he was at home. But he did have an explanation for why Dennis had found him inside of Don's house on that day. He said he was only there to feed Don's dog Buddy because nobody else was looking after the poor animal during the first few chaotic days following Don's death. Benny then leaned across the table and told Kaplan that if there was one person he should really be looking into, it was Dennis. Benny said that from the moment Dennis arrived from out of town, he had been acting really weird. Benny said he owned another townhouse just a few blocks away from Don's. And Dennis had apparently asked if he could rent it. He said he wanted to move some of Don's stuff into it and set it up as a new home for Sienna. Benny had found this whole thing very strange. When he ran a routine background check on Dennis, he discovered that he had a criminal record for assault and disorderly conduct, so he had told him no, he couldn't rent the place. Now, Kaplan already knew about Dennis's criminal record because he had run his name before bringing him in for questioning. But now, listening to this account from the landlord, he wondered why, after a year of complete estrangement, Dennis was suddenly so interested in taking over his brother's life and raising his daughter. But as the weeks passed, Kaplan just couldn't make a case against Dennis. In fact, he couldn't make a case against anybody. Neither Dennis nor Benny had alibis that could prove they weren't the killer. But there was also nothing that proved either of them were. The portrait of Don Fluitt as a loving father and a man of faith, a man who had completely reformed himself after some serious mistakes in his youth, appeared to be completely accurate. Don's most recent ex-wife, Christine, had fought with him over custody, but that battle seemed to have cooled off years ago. And both she and her new husband, Terry, had alibis that seemed to check out. Don also didn't appear to have any girlfriends he could have been fighting with. There just didn't seem to be anybody in his life who truly wanted Don dead. In February, about 6 weeks after the murder, the local newspaper ran a front-page article about the case. The headline said that the police had no suspects and no solid evidence. And when Kaplan read it, he had to admit to himself that it was more or less the truth. The investigation had hit a wall. The breakthrough that Detective Kaplan desperately needed wouldn't come until March of 2017, a full 12 weeks into the investigation. On that day, he got a call from the state forensics lab. They told him that the results from a key piece of evidence had just come in, and the person who had made this critical piece of evidence possible was Don Fluitt himself. Based on all the forensic evidence, the dozens of interviews, and the police investigation, here is what police believe happened to Don Fluitt on the night of the 28th of December 2016. The killer waited in the darkness, right outside of Don's house, until the garage door opened at about 7:40 in the evening. At that point, Don drove off with his daughter Sienna in the truck. And as soon as they were gone, the killer darted forward, tipped over the heavy plastic garbage can at the end of the driveway, and then retreated back into the shadows to wait. The killer had been nursing a grudge against Don for a very long time. It annoyed them that everyone in town seemed to think that Don was so great that he was some kind of saint. Because the killer knew that until just a few years earlier, Don had been a drug-abusing loser with 2 older kids that he didn't even seem to care for, and another one, Sienna, who he deserved to lose. But for some reason, nobody else saw Don for what he truly was. So, the killer had bided their time for as long as they could stand it. But finally, they had had enough. Don was just a dark cloud, constantly hovering over their life, and he had to go. The killer knew Don well enough to have his schedule figured out. They knew he was due to drop his daughter off at her mother's house that evening. They knew he'd be coming home alone after that. And they knew that before he went to bed, he would almost always go out into the garage to smoke a cigarette. The killer clutched a tire thumper in their hand. It's a small, heavy wooden bat that truckers use to check their tire pressure. And as they clutched it, they felt their heart race with anticipation. Finally, just before 8 o'clock, Don's truck came down the street. He pulled into the garage. And just as the killer had planned, while Don was out at the curb fixing the trash can, the killer snuck into the garage. They hid behind the neighbor's SUV as Don walked back up the driveway and pressed the button to close the garage door, and then went inside his own townhouse. At that point, the killer snuck out from behind the vehicle to get into a better position to ambush Don. And as they did this, they accidentally tripped the garage door's safety sensor, sending the door rolling back up and sending those little lights flashing. Thinking fast, the killer rushed over to the panel on the wall and pressed the button again to force the garage door to close. Then they held their breath, listening for any movement from inside the townhouse that would suggest Don had heard the noise and was coming out to check. But Don didn't seem to notice. The killer breathed out a quiet sigh of relief and took their position near the interior door, waiting in the dark. After a while, the doorknob jiggled. The killer realized this was it. They raised their weapon. And as soon as Don opened the door and stepped into the garage, they struck him in the head so hard that the wooden tire thumper broke into pieces. Then they punched Don again and again with their bare fists, finally letting out all the rage and resentment they had been pushing down for so long. Don did everything he could to fight back. He was a strong man, and he was fighting for his life. He had turned his whole life around. He had a daughter that he loved more than anything, a daughter he was trying to build an amazing life with. He was not just going to give up here in his garage. And so, as valiantly as he could, he fought the killer, scratching and clawing. But he had been gravely injured in the initial attack. And when he couldn't fight anymore, he just tried to crawl under his truck to hide. But the killer was relentless. They pulled him out and landed one last brutal punch to his face. Don stopped moving. And at that point, the killer wrapped their hands around his throat, and they squeezed and squeezed until he went limp. But the killer still wasn't done. To make absolutely sure that Don was dead, they went back into Don's apartment, they grabbed a large knife from a butcher block in the kitchen, and they came back into the garage. They knelt down next to Don's body and ruthlessly slit his throat. Blood ran out of the wound and began to pool on the concrete floor. The killer then found some bleach under the sink inside and tried to clean up the mess as best as they could. But in their haste, they left behind one crucial piece of evidence. Don was not able to save his own life that night. But by aggressively fighting back against his attacker, he had given investigators the one clue that would eventually solve his murder. And he would also ensure that in his absence, his daughter Sienna would be able to grow up in a safe and secure home. Because the key piece of forensic evidence that was left behind, the evidence that solved the entire case, was a tiny speck of DNA found under Dawn's fingernails. And that DNA belonged to none other than Sienna's own stepfather, Terry White. It would turn out that Terry's story to the cops about being at his sister's house until 9 o'clock that night was a lie. His sister had covered for him. And so on the 3rd of April 2017, just over 3 months after Dawn's murder, Terry White was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. After his arrest, Terry tried to cast blame on his wife, Christine, Dawn's ex-wife. He claimed that she was the one who had put him up to it, that she had manipulated him into killing Dawn so that they could have Sienna all to themselves and stop dealing with the custody arrangement. And so Christine was also arrested and charged with murder. But the charges against her were eventually dropped due to a complete lack of evidence. There was nothing to tie her to the crime except the word of her killer husband. Terry White, however, was convicted in August of 2018 of first-degree murder, aggravated burglary, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison plus an additional 12 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was the 4th of July, 2018. A paramedic was making his way through the busy hallways of a hospital in England when one of his supervisors stopped him. She had a very serious look on her face. She looked at him and asked if he had been part of the response team for a specific call that had come in a few days earlier. The paramedic thought for a second, then nodded. He said yes, he had been on that call. He didn't think much of it at the time. The call itself had felt pretty routine, so he couldn't imagine why his supervisor was singling this one out. But the moment he confirmed it, her expression grew even more urgent. She told him she would explain everything in a moment, but first, he needed to take off all of his gear. Every single piece of it. He needed to do it right now. The supervisor explained there was a very real possibility that the uniform he was wearing could kill him. The story really begins a few days earlier, on the afternoon of the 29th of June 2018. A 44-year-old woman named Dawn Sturgis was sitting on a blanket in a park in the city of Salisbury, England. She was with a few of her friends and her boyfriend, a man named Charlie Rowley. They were drinking some wine, just enjoying a nice Friday afternoon. This was one of Dawn's favorite things to do, especially because it meant spending time with Charlie. They had been dating for about 16 months, and she was deeply in love with him. For Dawn, Charlie was like the one true bright spot in what had been a very difficult life. Dawn had struggled for years with alcoholism and an undiagnosed case of bipolar disorder. Because of these challenges, she found it hard to keep a steady job. For the past couple of years, she had been living in a therapeutic group home, a place meant to help people get back on their feet. It was shortly after she moved in there that she met Charlie. Now, if you just looked at their situations on paper, you wouldn't think they were a good match. Charlie had his own struggles. He was addicted to heroin, he didn't have a job, and he often found himself in trouble with the law. When they first started seeing each other, the people in Dawn's life were worried. They thought Charlie would just drag her further down, making her own problems even worse. But against all odds, they made each other genuinely happy. They spent almost all their time together, either at her place or his, or just hanging out in the park with their friends. This newfound happiness with Charlie had inspired Dawn. It made her want to make some real positive changes in her life. She was still drinking, but she had finally gotten a proper diagnosis for her bipolar disorder and was on medication that was helping her feel stable for the first time in a very long time. She was even making plans to move out of the group home and get her own apartment soon. She saw it as a chance for a true, fresh start. To celebrate all these positive steps, Dawn had planned a get-together with her family. It was scheduled for just a few days away, and she was excited to show them how much better she was doing. She really wanted Charlie to be there with her. In her mind, their relationship was a huge part of why she felt so motivated to turn her life around. But right at this moment, sitting in the park on this Friday, despite how much she loved Charlie and how excited she was for their future, she was actually very angry with him. Before they had come to the park, Charlie and some of their friends had done heroin and other drugs. And now, under the influence, Charlie was being a complete jerk. Dawn had recently bought some new hair dye because she wanted a new look for the family gathering. She wanted to look her best. But Charlie, high as a kite, thought it would be funny to waste the dye by putting it all over his beard and in his eyebrows. He was doing it as a joke, but Dawn wasn't laughing. She was furious. It wasn't just about the wasted dye. It was about what it represented. She knew that with his beard and eyebrows dyed some ridiculous color, Charlie would look like a mess when he met her family for the first time. This meeting was incredibly important to her. She tried to explain this to him, to tell him why she was so upset. After she confronted him, Charlie did go and try to wash the dye out. He managed to get most of it off his face, but the damage was done. Dawn still felt so annoyed by the whole thing. It felt like he didn't understand how much this meant to her. Why would he do something so stupid and risk ruining this important moment? In the end, even after he had cleaned himself up, she just couldn't let it go. She stood up, grabbed her things, and just stormed off, leaving Charlie and their friends behind to pack up the blanket and the rest of their stuff. She was just done for the day. Hours later, around 10 o'clock that night, Dawn was lying on the couch in Charlie's living room. She was listening to Charlie and their friend, a man named Sam Hobson, talk about how unpredictable and unfair life could be. Dawn was still feeling a bit irritated with Charlie, but for the most part, her good mood had returned. After she had left the park in a huff, she had gone back to her place and used what was left of the hair dye on her own hair. Then, she had called her mom. Dawn had 3 children of her own, 2 of whom were already adults. But her youngest child was in the custody of Dawn's own mother. During the phone call, Dawn had asked if maybe her youngest could come to the family get-together tomorrow. Her mother had said yes, and that made Dawn really happy. She was looking forward to seeing everyone. But right now, all she really wanted was to go to sleep. She pushed herself up from the couch and started to make her way to the bathroom to get her nightly medication. Getting there was a challenge in itself. She had to carefully step over and around all the junk and random items that were scattered all over the floor of Charlie's apartment. Charlie had a habit of going out and finding things on the street or in dumpsters and bringing them home. Sometimes he would sell what he found, but a lot of it just ended up piling up, making the apartment incredibly cluttered. Dawn managed to navigate the maze of stuff, got her pills from the bathroom, and made her way back to the couch. She swallowed the medication with a bit of water and then laid back down, settling into the cushions. Within minutes, she was fast asleep. The next morning, Dawn woke up on Charlie's couch just a little before 9:30. She had a slight hangover, just a dull headache, but by her standards, it wasn't too bad. She hadn't drunk that much the day before, so she considered it a decent start to her day. A few minutes later, Charlie walked into the living room. He sat down on the couch next to her and wished her good morning. Between her headache and her lingering annoyance from yesterday's hair dye incident, Dawn really wasn't in the mood to talk to him. But before she could say anything, Charlie's eyes suddenly lit up. He told her he had almost forgotten something. He had a present for her, something he'd gotten a few days ago. With that, he jumped up and disappeared into the kitchen. He came back, holding a small box, which he presented to her. He said it was her gift. This completely changed Dawn's mood. All her irritation just melted away. Dawn didn't receive gifts very often. She had plenty of friends who cared about her, but like her and Charlie, they didn't have a lot of money to spare. So, getting a gift was a rare and special event for her. To be getting one now, out of the blue, was incredibly exciting. She smiled a huge, genuine smile and carefully lifted the lid off the box. Inside, nestled in the packaging, was what looked like a very expensive bottle of perfume. She gasped when she saw it. The bottle looked brand new and fancy. She knew she could never have afforded something like this for herself. She was honestly shocked that Charlie had managed to get it for her. She couldn't imagine how he had done it. Dawn threw her arms around Charlie and gave him a big hug. She told him she absolutely loved it. She carefully took the bottle out of the box. She sprayed a little bit of the perfume onto one of her wrists, then rubbed her wrists together. She sniffed it and thought it smelled wonderful. So elegant. Then she handed the bottle back to Charlie and asked him to put it somewhere safe for her. With a big smile still on her face, she stood up from the couch and went to find her makeup bag. It was time to get ready for the day. About 5 minutes later, Dawn was sitting back on the couch. She had her makeup bag in her lap and was applying foundation to her face. As she worked, she was chatting with Charlie, telling him she was thinking about adding another streak of color to her hair, maybe a blue one this time. But just as she finished with her foundation and reached for her powder, she felt her headache from the morning suddenly get much, much worse. She winced, closing her eyes and hoping the sharp pain would pass. But it didn't. Soon, she started to feel lightheaded and dizzy. She also realized she was sweating, a lot more than she should have been. She stopped talking about her hair and told Charlie that she was feeling really weird. Charlie looked concerned. He asked her if she wanted him to get her some painkillers, but Dawn just shook her head no. She had already taken her prescribed medication for the day and didn't want to take any more pills, worried it might upset her stomach. Instead, she handed her makeup bag to Charlie and asked him to put it back in the bedroom for her. Then she hurried towards the bathroom, planning to splash some cold water on her face. By the time she got into the bathroom and turned on the tap, her whole body felt like it was on fire. She was sweating so profusely that just splashing water on her face didn't feel like it was helping at all. The feeling was overwhelming. So, on instinct, she just climbed right into the empty bathtub. She figured the cold, hard surface of the tub would feel good against her hot skin and might help her cool down. But as soon as she lay down inside the tub, she felt her breath catch in her chest. It was becoming hard to breathe. Back in the living room, Charlie heard Dawn moving around in the bathroom. He heard the water turn on, then off again, and then the sound of her rustling around. He was a little worried about her, but he also knew that she got hangovers from time to time, and she had clearly woken up with one today. He figured this was just a really bad one. Besides, he was feeling a bit off himself and really wanted to leave. He had plans to meet up with his friend Sam to get some more heroin. He knew that would take the edge off his own headache and nausea. But before he could get up to leave, he heard a strange sound coming from the bathroom. At first, he couldn't quite place it. It was a kind of gurgling noise. Then he realized what it was. At that point, all thoughts of leaving vanished. He jumped to his feet and rushed to the bathroom door. When he threw it open, he gasped at what he saw. Dawn was lying in the empty bathtub, fully clothed, and there was foam coming from her mouth. She was frothing. Charlie had no idea what was happening, but his instincts took over. He ran over to her, pulled her out of the tub, and gently laid her down on the bathroom floor. He could tell she was basically unconscious. Her body was limp. He leaned in close to her face and listened, but he couldn't tell if she was even breathing. In that moment, Charlie knew this was not a hangover. This was something far more serious. He scrambled to find a phone and immediately dialed the emergency line. When the dispatcher answered, Charlie frantically tried to explain what was going on. He told them his girlfriend Dawn had just collapsed in the bathtub out of nowhere. The operator got his address and assured him they would send paramedics right away. But they also told Charlie that he needed to perform CPR on Dawn while he waited for help to arrive. The dispatcher then started giving him instructions over the phone, telling him exactly what to do. Charlie was terrified, but he took a deep breath and tried to follow their directions. He had to help Dawn. He kept the phone on speaker beside him as he straddled Dawn's chest and began giving her compressions. It felt like an eternity, but it was an agonizing 19 minutes before a single paramedic finally walked through the door. By that time, Dawn's skin had started to turn a terrifying shade of blue. Charlie paced anxiously around his small apartment while the paramedic took over the chest compressions. He could hear the paramedic on his radio calling for more backup. And sure enough, just a few minutes later, more paramedics arrived and streamed into the apartment. At first, seeing more medical professionals made Charlie feel a little hopeful. He thought that more help meant a better chance that Dawn was going to be okay. But then, from his spot in the living room, he overheard one of the paramedics say something about drugs. They were talking about the possibility of an overdose. As soon as Charlie heard that, he called out to them, insisting that Dawn didn't do drugs. But in the chaos of the small bathroom, the paramedics didn't seem to hear him. A second later, their voices became more urgent. They were using a lot of medical terms that Charlie didn't understand, but he did catch one phrase very clearly. Dawn's heart had stopped. The paramedics worked tirelessly and were eventually able to get her heart beating again. But it took them more than an hour to get her stable enough to be moved from the apartment to the hospital. Charlie just watched, completely panicked and filled with despair, as they loaded his girlfriend onto a stretcher. He followed them out of the apartment, wanting to stay by Dawn's side for as long as he possibly could. Just before they closed the doors of the ambulance, he leaned in close to her and told her that he would meet her at the hospital. He promised. As the ambulance doors shut and the sirens blared to life, Charlie's friend Sam appeared. He looked completely shocked by all the commotion. They had made plans to go to a church event that day, one that was offering free food. Charlie had completely forgotten about it. He quickly told Sam everything that had just happened and explained that he couldn't go to the event. He needed to get to the hospital as fast as he could to be with Dawn. But even as he was saying the words out loud, a harsh reality set in. He knew he couldn't just go straight to the hospital. If he went there now, he had no idea how long he would be there. And since he was addicted to heroin, he knew that if he didn't get some drugs into his system soon, he would start to get incredibly sick from withdrawal. Charlie felt completely trapped. He didn't know what to do. The stress and fear were so overwhelming that he felt like he was on the verge of a complete breakdown. This was all just too much to handle. But then he remembered something. He had a prescription for methadone waiting for him at the local pharmacy. Methadone is a medication often given to people addicted to heroin who are trying to get clean. It helps manage the addiction and the severe symptoms of withdrawal. It mimics some of the effects of the drug on the body, but without providing the euphoric high. Charlie hadn't actually gotten around to filling his methadone prescription yet, mostly because getting clean hadn't been his top priority. But now, as he thought about needing to be at the hospital all day, needing to be coherent and able to talk to doctors and nurses and be there for Dawn, an idea formed. He thought if he went and got his methadone and took it, it would keep him from getting sick from withdrawal, but it would also allow him to keep a clear head. He could be present and helpful at the hospital. So Charlie turned to Sam and asked if he would come with him on a different trip, a trip to the pharmacy to pick up his methadone. A couple of hours later, at around 3:30 inches the afternoon, Charlie and Sam got back to Charlie's apartment. It had been an incredibly hot day, and after walking all over town, they were both dripping with sweat. After they had gone to the pharmacy, Charlie and Sam had actually stopped by that church event. They didn't go for the food. They went to literally say a prayer for Dawn. Now they were back at Charlie's place. He needed to pack an overnight bag for himself and also one for Dawn to bring to her at the hospital. He still didn't know how long he would be there, but now that he had his methadone, he figured he would be okay. But as Charlie started gathering things, he found it was hard to think straight. He had a really intense headache, and even though they were inside now, he just couldn't stop sweating. Charlie thought to himself that maybe it was the methadone. He had never taken it before, and he reasoned that maybe these were just some of the side effects. He decided that he would just take a quick shower. He thought that might help clear his head and make him feel a bit more normal. But after he got out of the shower, he felt even worse. He looked at his reflection in the mirror and noticed that his pupils were constricted into tiny little pinpricks. Still, he tried to push through it. He went into his bedroom to get dressed and finish packing Dawn's bag. But as just a couple of minutes passed, he noticed his heart began to race. It got faster and faster and faster, and he couldn't seem to do anything to calm it down. Now, over the past couple of days, between the heroin and now the methadone, Charlie had consumed a lot of drugs. But he used drugs all the time, and he had never ever felt this specific combination of symptoms before. This felt different. This felt wrong. Charlie left the bedroom and walked back into the living room. He just sat down on the couch, feeling completely and utterly awful. A strange thought popped into his head. He thought, okay, this doesn't feel like the drugs. I always do drugs, and this isn't it. I've never felt like this. His eyes landed on his friend Sam, who was also in the room. And then a bizarre paranoid thought took hold. What if Sam poisoned me? What if that's what's happening here? What if I've been poisoned? Without really thinking it through, without considering how or when or why Sam would do such a thing, Charlie began to yell at him. He accused him, saying, "You poisoned me. Why did you do this to me?" Sam was completely caught off guard. He looked stunned and confused and said, "What are you talking about?" He started backing away from Charlie. But Charlie just jumped up from the couch and started to move towards Sam as if he was about to attack him. But after taking only a couple of steps, Charlie's mouth suddenly filled up with so much saliva that he couldn't speak clearly anymore. All that came out was a gurgling sound as froth spilled from his lips. Then his legs became weak and wobbly. He had to lean against the wall just to keep himself from collapsing to the floor. And then he felt his entire body begin to seize up. The very last thing Charlie was aware of was seeing his friend Sam grabbing a phone and calling for another ambulance. About an hour later, inside the emergency room of the Salisbury District Hospital, the on-call doctor stood in Charlie Rowley's treatment room. A nurse at his bedside was drawing a sample of his blood. The doctor had just finished examining Charlie, who was now unconscious. It was clear that he had suffered a seizure. He also had a high fever, his pupils were constricted, and his breathing was labored. To the doctor, it was obvious that Charlie's condition was extremely serious. But the doctor was also sure he knew exactly what had caused it. Charlie had overdosed on drugs. The doctor felt very confident in this diagnosis, especially because Charlie's girlfriend, Dawn, had been brought in that very morning and treated for the exact same thing. She had been admitted after her heart had stopped, and she had presented with many of the same symptoms that Charlie was now showing. The medical team had managed to stabilize her, but she had been admitted to the intensive care unit and was still listed in critical condition. So, the doctor felt his diagnosis for both Dawn and Charlie was solid. The symptoms fit the profile of a severe opioid overdose. Plus, the police officer in charge of both of their cases had confirmed that Charlie, at the very least, was a known drug user. And the apartment where both of them had collapsed was reportedly full of needles and other drug paraphernalia. It all seemed to point in one direction. Over the next 24 hours, neither Dawn nor Charlie showed any signs of improvement. In fact, they both got much, much worse. Their nervous systems began to completely break down. This meant that essential bodily functions, like breathing, were starting to fail. Dawn had fallen into a deep coma and was being kept alive by a life support machine. Charlie was also still unconscious, and his breathing had deteriorated so much that doctors had to put him on a ventilator to breathe for him. He had also been moved to the intensive care unit, just like Dawn. At this point, it was becoming clear to the medical staff that this probably wasn't a simple drug overdose. The way their conditions were progressing was not typical. It seemed more likely that they had taken a bad batch of drugs, maybe something that had been contaminated with a poison, or perhaps it was something else entirely. But none of the doctors or nurses could figure out what was actually wrong with them. Their cases were a complete medical mystery. By the afternoon of July 3rd, which was 3 days after Dawn and Charlie were first hospitalized, one of the doctors in the intensive care unit had officially taken over both of their cases. His name was Dr. Stephen Jukes. Dr. Jukes had reviewed the results from the initial toxicology screenings. They showed that while Charlie did have a significant amount of heroin and other drugs in his system, Dawn did not. The only things that showed up in her results were her prescribed psychiatric medications. So, Doctor, Jukes had sent more of their blood samples to a different, more specialized lab to be tested for a much wider range of drugs and toxins. He was still waiting for those results to come back, but he was starting to lose faith that they would give him the answer he was looking for. "By now, Doctor." Jukes had managed to rule out a few other possibilities that could have caused their symptoms. For a while, there was a theory that maybe the two of them had been exposed to a gas leak in Charlie's apartment. Some of the symptoms of gas poisoning are similar to what Dawn and Charlie were experiencing. But the main reason this theory didn't hold up was the timing. Dawn and Charlie had been in the apartment together on the morning she was brought to the hospital. If there was a gas leak, they presumably would have both been exposed at the same time and gotten sick around the same time. But only Dawn was affected initially. Charlie was fine. Then, Charlie left the apartment for several hours, so he was completely away from any potential source of a leak. It was only after he came back to the apartment that he started to feel sick. It just didn't add up. Also, none of the first responders who had been inside the apartment working on Dawn had reported smelling anything unusual. Of course, some dangerous gases, like carbon monoxide, are odorless, but a typical natural gas leak has a very distinct smell, like rotten eggs. Plus, there was the fact that when Charlie got sick, his friend Sam was in the apartment with him, and Sam didn't get sick at all. So, all things considered, the gas leak theory seemed highly unlikely. Doctor. Jukes had also briefly considered if what happened to Dawn and Charlie could be connected to a strange toxin exposure case that had come through that very same hospital a couple of months earlier. However, the victims in that particular case were from another country, and as far as anyone knew, Dawn and Charlie had not recently traveled outside of England. So, Doctor. Jukes had ruled that out as well. But Doctor. Jukes did have one theory that he still thought had potential. Maybe this was a case of pesticide poisoning. The symptoms were a good match. And Doctor. Jukes knew that sometimes street drugs can be accidentally or intentionally contaminated with powerful pesticides. So, if Dawn and Charlie had both taken some kind of drug that he hadn't tested for yet, it was possible they could have been exposed that way. He had already shared this theory with the police, and they had issued a press release to the public encouraging drug users to be extra cautious in case there was a contaminated supply out there. But Doctor. Jukes also knew that contaminated drugs were not the only way people could be exposed to pesticides. Simply eating, drinking, or breathing in contaminated food, water, or air could be just as fatal. This possibility was extremely troubling to Dr. Jukes and everyone else involved in the case. Because if Dawn and Charlie had been exposed to potentially deadly chemicals just by going about their normal lives in their home or their neighborhood, it meant that everyone else in their community could also be in danger. Without being able to speak to Dawn or Charlie, there was no way to know for sure where they had been, what they had touched, or what they might have ingested before they got sick. Dr. Jukes felt like he needed to get that information from somewhere else, and he needed it fast. The next morning, July 4th, 4 days after Dawn and Charlie had gotten sick, Dr. Jukes pushed open the door to a small family waiting room in the hospital. Inside, Dawn's mother, her 3 sisters, and her son were all waiting. He had heard they were there visiting Dawn, so he had asked a nurse to bring them to this room so he could speak with them privately. He was hoping they might be able to shed some light on where Dawn had been and what she might have been doing before she collapsed. As soon as he walked in, the family looked up at him with anxious expressions. He had barely gotten his name out before they started asking him questions about what was happening and why the news was portraying Dawn as some kind of drug addict. Doctor. Jukes held up his hand gently to quiet them. Once they had settled down, he explained that at the very beginning they had believed it was an overdose because her symptoms looked just like one. But now, based on how her condition had progressed, he knew that an overdose was very unlikely to be the cause. Then he told them about his theory involving pesticides and said he really needed their help. He asked them to tell him everything they could about Dawn, her habits, her health history, and the people she usually spent her time with. Dawn's mother told him she had spoken to Dawn on the phone the night before all of this had started. She said Dawn had seemed perfectly fine. She had even asked if her youngest daughter could come to the family get-together they were planning. Beyond that, though, the family admitted that they didn't know a lot about Dawn's daily life with Charlie and her friends in Salisbury. They knew she struggled with alcoholism and her mental health, and she didn't always share everything with them. They were pretty sure, however, that she rarely ever left the city. But the main thing the family wanted Dr. Jukes to understand was that Dawn was not just some nobody, the way the media was making her out to be. She was a loving mother, a sister, a daughter, and a friend. She was someone who was really, genuinely trying to do better, and she was succeeding. She didn't want much from life. She just wanted a place of her own and a little more stability. She was on the right path to get those things. They begged him not to give up on her. Dr. Jukes promised them that he wouldn't. But as he left the room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment. He was glad to know more about Dawn as a person. She sounded like a wonderful woman. But he had been desperately hoping for some kind of breakthrough, some clue about what could have possibly happened to her. And he hadn't gotten one. None of them had been able to give him any information that could begin to explain what was going on. At this point, he really wasn't sure what else he could do. As Dr. Jukes was heading back towards his office, trying to figure out his next move, he saw a lab technician rushing down the hallway towards him. The tech was holding a piece of paper and looked frantic. When he reached Dr. Jukes, he shoved the paper into his hands. The tech was out of breath, but managed to tell Dr. Jukes that he had to read this immediately. So, Dr. Jukes looked down at the paper. He saw that it was the latest lab results for Dawn and Charlie. And as he scanned the contents, he could not believe what he was reading. The new, more comprehensive blood tests he had ordered did not show the presence of pesticides or any other street drugs. But they did show something else. Something so unexpected and so incredibly dangerous that Dr. Jukes knew in an instant that Dawn and Charlie were not the only ones at risk here. Everyone was at risk. Literally everyone in Charlie's apartment building, everyone in their neighborhood, all the paramedics, all the police officers, all the doctors and nurses who had treated them, and all the other patients in the hospital. In fact, it was even possible that everyone in the entire city was now in danger, and it might already be too late. Dr. Jukes turned and sprinted down the hall towards his office. He burst through the door, grabbed the phone, and called the police. A few hours later, a man named Philip Murphy stood on the street outside of Charlie's apartment building. Murphy was the deputy head of investigations for one of England's counter-terrorism units. His team had established a wide perimeter, completely cordoning off the entire building and evacuating every single person who lived inside. Dozens of officers and highly specialized crime scene technicians were moving in and out of the building, all of them wearing bulky, full-body protective suits. They were methodically swabbing every surface and carefully collecting any potential evidence. Because of those lab tests that Dr. Jukes had run, Murphy knew exactly what substance had made Dawn and Charlie sick. But he had no idea how they could have possibly come into contact with it. And answering that question was no longer just a medical mystery or a local police matter. It was now a matter of international security. It wasn't just Murphy's counterterrorism unit that was involved now. Multiple other agencies had been brought in, including the UK's Secret Service, also known as MI5. MI5 would be responsible for dealing with the other countries that were now becoming involved in this investigation. In addition to securing Charlie's apartment, the counterterrorism unit had been deployed to the hospital. They were now requiring anyone who visited Dawn and Charlie to wear protective gear. They had contacted all of the paramedics and police officers who had interacted with them and instructed them to bag up their uniforms and all of their equipment to be treated as biohazards. Some police officers were now tasked with sifting through thousands of hours of CCTV footage from all around the city, going back several weeks looking for any sign of Dawn or Charlie. Others were contacting their friends to try and piece together a timeline of their recent movements. At least one friend had already taken officers on a tour of the park, where they had all been hanging out the day before Dawn and Charlie got sick. Murphy already had a team heading to that park to close it off and begin taking more samples. He also had another team doing the same thing at Don's home. As Murphy stood there on the street watching the officers in their white suits move in and out of Charlie's apartment, he knew that as massive as this operation already was, it was really just the beginning. He knew he was going to have to be patient. Even though the situation was clearly urgent, he also knew that it could take a very long time to figure out exactly what had happened and why. At this point, all Murphy and anyone else could do was hope that the authorities could find some answers before more people got hurt. But just 4 days later, on July 8th, Dawn Sturgis was taken off life support and passed away in the hospital. Her death was an incredible tragedy for her family. For Murphy and the investigation, it was also a major blow. He had been hoping that she might wake up, that he would get a chance to speak to her. She was a potential treasure trove of information about how this whole thing had happened. And now, he would never get that chance. On July 11th, which was 11 days after Dawn and Charlie first got sick, the situation stood like this. Dawn was now deceased, and Charlie was still alive but was unable to talk. The various agencies working on the case had managed to test and eliminate almost every location that Dawn and Charlie had visited as being the source of the toxic substance. Every place except for one. The only location they couldn't rule out was Charlie's apartment. So Murphy sent the forensics team back to the apartment to search it all over again, even more thoroughly this time. That afternoon, a lead officer with the forensics team stood in the middle of Charlie's small, cluttered apartment alongside some of his colleagues. The lead officer and his entire team were dressed in very heavy-duty advanced protective suits. They moved slowly and deliberately around the cramped space, taking new samples from surfaces and bagging anything that could be potential evidence. The sheer amount of clutter in the apartment made their job incredibly difficult. There were clothes piled up on the floor, open bags of fabric, and dirty dishes stacked high in the sink and on the kitchen counters. The trash cans were overflowing. In the bedroom, there was a mix of makeup and some empty hair dye boxes scattered on the floor, right alongside used needles and other drug paraphernalia. There wasn't a lot of furniture in the apartment, but what was there had been pushed around and was in disarray, mostly from when the paramedics had been rushing to treat Dawn. Other areas of the apartment were littered with medical debris, like discarded rubber gloves and plastic wrappers from equipment. And there were just random objects everywhere, water bottles, plastic toys, all sorts of things piled up on the windowsills. It felt like there was almost too much stuff in the apartment to even effectively test it all. But as the lead officer walked around doing his best to identify items that needed to be tested, something on a kitchen counter caught his eye. It was an object that looked very different from everything else in the apartment. It didn't seem to belong. Now, to understand what happened to Dawn and Charlie, you have to go back in time, 3.5 months before they got sick. Back then, an unrelated older man and a younger woman were found unresponsive on a park bench in Salisbury. They were brought to the Salisbury District Hospital, the very same one that Dawn and Charlie would later be taken to. When this man and woman came into the hospital, they were experiencing seizures and they couldn't stop vomiting. But after receiving treatment at the hospital, they both made a full recovery. At first, the doctors there, including Dr. Jukes, thought that this man and woman were just regular civilians who had gotten sick, maybe from a drug overdose. But it soon became clear that neither of those things was true. First, they were not just regular civilians. The older man was a former Russian spy who had defected to England, and the young woman was his daughter. And they had definitely not overdosed. They had been poisoned. A major investigation discovered that the substance used to poison them was an extremely rare and deadly chemical weapon that had been created by Russia. It was called Novichok, a type of nerve agent. And so, 3.5 months later, after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized and their conditions were getting worse and worse, that lab tech had rushed down the hallway to show Dr. Jukes their new lab results. The name of the deadly chemical that Dr. Jukes saw printed on that paper, the substance that was in their system, was Novichok. Investigators in the original spy poisoning case had never been able to figure out exactly how the poison had been administered to the spy and his daughter. But the item that Murphy's forensics team had now found on the counter in Charlie's apartment, the one that stood out and didn't look like it belonged there, was the item that finally solved that mystery. It would turn out that Charlie had found the source of the poison completely by accident. It was that brand new bottle of perfume that he had so proudly given to Dawn on the morning they both got sick. Charlie hadn't actually bought this gift at a store. He could never have afforded something so expensive. Instead, he had found it in a charity donation dumpster during one of his many dumpster diving trips. And that dumpster just so happened to be the exact same one where a Russian agent had discarded the poison delivery device after the attempted assassination of the spy and his daughter. The device had been cleverly disguised to look exactly like a high-end bottle of perfume. So when Dawn accepted Charlie's gift and, in her excitement, sprayed what she thought was perfume directly onto her wrists, she had accidentally exposed herself and, by extension, Charlie to the deadly nerve agent. Charlie would eventually recover from his exposure to the Novichok. As for the 3 Russian agents that authorities believe were involved in the attack, they returned to Russia and have never been prosecuted. Russia has consistently denied any involvement in the poisoning. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.